very badly, but I'm more very friendly and supportive of the view of big laws. So this is what I'm going to talk about today. I'm gonna share my PowerPoint. Since the time is quite limited, I go as fast as I can. So today I'm going to talk about climate crisis and ecological revolution, and I deal with three different kinds of imaginative future vision, and I criticize two, and I defend the last one, the eco-socialism, basically. So we are living in the Anthropocene. I think Chakrabarti talked about it yesterday, so I'm not going into this. But the situation looks like the end of the future, as Bill McKibben argued. But this end of nature didn't realize any human domination over nature. Rather, what we are witnessing today is increasing uncontrollability of nature. And some people talk about actually the return of nature, the extinction of species, desertification, super hurricane, soil erosion. These are problems that humans cannot really adequately solve. So after 30 years of the famous Fukuyama's declaration about the end of history, what we are witnessing under this celebration of global neoliberal capitalism is end of human civilization. So the whole point is we need much more radical vision, much more radical theoretical framework, because I'm not going to talk about how fast we need to reduce the carbon dioxide, because everyone knows about this. But the whole point is that it seems very unlikely that we can attain zero carbon emission by 2050 with the current pace of economic growth. So that's why people are talking about system change, not climate change everywhere. But the point is, or the question is, what kind of system change do we want? That's I'm going to talk about. One is, of course, green capitalism. People talk about Green New Deal everywhere, and I characterize Green New Deal as climate Keynesianism. I'm not fully rejecting Green New Deal as such, but I'm basically criticizing here climate Keynesianism, the kind of Green New Deal suggested by those supporters of the green capitalism. In this context, the pandemic is a very interesting case. Pandemic marks the end of the neoliberal austerity and the beginning of the new age of the fiscal stimulus. It's very surprising that even politicians and big corporations are welcoming the government spending increase. And I think, these people are talking about austerity for such a long time, but now they're talking about green investment a lot, because this is a kind of welcome situation for many corporations. It opens up the new opportunities for huge investment to revive the real economy stagnating in the last 20 years, but now they can even get the support from the government. And this is also the end of the financial capitalism. So pandemic creates the situation, this is characterized by two ends: the end of neoliberal austerity and the end of financial capitalism. So they're going to, using this Green New Deal policy, invest in solar panel, electric vehicles, and whatsoever. They really need to rebuild the entire social infrastructure. So we are witnessing the opening up of new ways of investing in the real economy. So they expect, or they hope, that this economic growth through the greening of the entire economy offer the possibility to attain the broad consensus, not just among the elites, but also from the lower and middle class in the global north, creating new jobs, booming the economy, rising wages and rising demand, etc. But this is nothing but the formation of new kind of the imperial Lebensweise, the imperial ways of living, in the age of climate crisis, as Marx Thyssen and Ulrich Brandt once discussed imperial Lebensweise after World War II, but this is a new stage in the climate crisis. It will only lead to the ecological imperialism, I assume, not just because of the myth of decoupling that Kallis and Hickel convincingly demonstrated. We are not witnessing any absolute decoupling in the current growing system of economy. But also the problem is that green capitalism is not fast enough to tackle climate crisis, especially because short-term profit is not compatible with long-term universal metabolism in nature. But also the problem is that Green New Deal basically strengthens the ecological imperialism and unequal exchange of labor, resources, and environmental damage. This is very characteristic to imperial Lebensweise. The reducing CO2 in the global north by building solar panels or electric vehicles or whatsoever is realized only through much more intensive and extensive robbery of nature in the global south. And this tendency is already becoming apparent in the last few months in the rising price of lithium, the cobalt, and nickel, and the other kinds of rare earth. Those prices going up because all the countries are now expecting the huge demand in the future. So in this ecological imperialism, the capital accumulation can go on and on, but not free and just sustainable development. So the economic crisis can be postponed successfully, but the ecological crisis becomes only worse and severe, especially in the global south. So we need to challenge much more radically the green capitalism. I don't have time because I want to talk about Marx in the second half, so I'm not really arguing in detail, but many people like Kallis and Hickel already demonstrated that this kind of Green New Deal doesn't really work, only works for the global north. So I think in the Anthropocene, even though Chakrabarti doesn't really want to talk about capitalism anymore in the Anthropocene, I'm not sure if he talked about capitalism yesterday, but he doesn't talk about capitalism. But I think if we really want to solve this problem of climate crisis, we need to challenge capitalism. And that's why there's a growing interest in eco-socialism and degrowth, and we are invited today as a speaker, I hope. And I think, so I'm basically defending the position of eco-socialism, but I also want to show that eco-socialism is quite compatible with degrowth. And Marx's vision of eco-socialism is compatible with degrowth too. However, as Zara just talked about in the introduction, Marxism is quite notorious for the Promethean vision of the future. Prometheanism is basically about absolute domination of nature through technology. And the problem, so what we have is the eco-socialism is not always green. It's rather brown, I'd say. And I have been trying to demonstrate that eco-socialism is green, and Marx himself was quite seriously interested in the problem of ecology. But against this, what I have been confronting in the last few years is this defense, the passionate defense of Prometheanism, even among the left. Ray Brassiel famously defended the Prometheanism, and he basically called for the reviving the Promethean idea as the central identity of Marxism. And there's a clear affinity between Marx and eco-modernism, like Breakthrough Institute, etc. And those people basically argue that Anthropocene already signals too much intervention in nature, too much human intervention. So we cannot retreat from this situation. Bruno Latour once famously called it "Love Your Monster." So it's basically about necessity of further human intervention or further control of nature for the sake of the survival of humanity, if not human emancipation. So some Marxists argue for the further usage of nuclear power plants, geoengineering, or negative emission technologies. And they even criticize the degrowth movement as a kind of folk politics. The folk politics basically means that it's local, small scale, and minoritarian social movements that doesn't have any impact upon the global capitalism. We need to change, so says Surnicek, for example. We need to really challenge the global capitalism as a world system. So the folk politics is a very inadequate way of challenging this system, like Occupy movement. We didn't change anything, that's what they say. So the people like Aaron Bastani in his book, Fully Automated Luxury Communism, basically celebrate new technologies as the foundation of post-capitalism. They hope that the technological development under capitalism creates a post-scarcity future, and it will ultimately blow capitalism sky high. That's what that expression comes from Grundrisse said. But obviously, Marx did not simply praise the capitalist development of productive forces as a progress of history, simply because of the fact that technology under capitalism is not neutral at all. This is what he argues in Capital as the problem of productive forces of capital. The point is basically that productive forces of capital is about increasing productive forces for the sake of domination over workers and nature. The capitalist development of technologies is not about liberating workers from work. It's about disciplining them, controlling them, commanding over them. So it only reinforces the regime of capital. It only builds a further domination over workers. And Richard York and Brett Clark also argues that the capitalist technology as a productive forces of capital can only shift the metabolic rift, but it can never really repair it. That's the problem that what we just witnessed in my critique of the Green New Deal, right? It's just about imperial Lebensweise in the global north, but the problem is simply shifted to somewhere else, some other kind of people. But the problem of the rift remains all the time. So what I problematize, what I see in Bastani is the puberty of philosophy or puberty of imagination, because Bastani can imagine a post-capitalist and a post-scarcity future only based on capitalist technologies such as EV and electric vehicles and solar panels and more artificial meat and asteroid mining, etc. But this is not the way that we should be aiming at. Why? Oh, by the way, this is my new book, Das Kapital in Anthropocene. It just appeared in Japanese. Basically, I'm arguing for like degrowth communism. And but what I argued in this book, I'm currently writing an English version of it. But if I very roughly summarize, but what we witness in Bastani is the persistence of capitalist realism. It is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. That's capitalist realism. I'm calling for regaining much more radical post-capitalist imaginary, because without such imagination, ecological revolution ends up simply demanding accelerating what already exists, such as basic income, modern monetary theory, Green New Deal, global tax, full automation. All are simply accelerating what already potentially exists. It's not really different from what capitalism offers. That's my conviction. And that's also what Zizek points out as a paradox of radical policies. Here's what he means. In order to realize the ideal kind of basic income, Green New Deal, or modern monetary theory, because basic income could be utilized by more conservative people to cut social welfare, etc. So if we want to have really emancipating kinds of basic income or Green New Deal, the power of the social movement must be so strong, really strong, so strong that even we can overcome capitalism. because otherwise conservative people or like right-wing people simply dominate the basic income and they use it for other purposes. So if we really need to have a strong power to beat those enemies, one could say. But if we can beat enemies, why do we preserve capitalism? If we can beat enemies, we should simply abolish capitalism as such. So the main contradiction is that they want to have some radical vision through radical policies like modern monetary theory or basic income whatsoever, but they want to conserve fundamental characteristics of capitalism, such as wage labor, market competition, endless economic growth, etc. So these are not very convincing way of imagining utopia, because utopia can be more characterized by less work, more commons, more creative activities or whatsoever. But this is something that has been seriously marginalized and oppressed under the capitalist model production. And in order to bring up this kind of marginalized utopia back into the table again, I think it is also necessary to redefine abundance and scarcity. And this is why the humanities is very important, because we can sort of have this new definition of these concepts, and so that we can have a more non-productivist and post-scarcity society. And this is also conducted recently by Benham in his critique of true automation. But in any case, I do this by going back to Marx. And the problem is that basically under capitalism, we can never have abundance. Capitalism is a system that is ultimately essentially characterized by scarcity, because capitalism aims at endless growth, endless capital accumulation. So it is really, no matter how much it develops, it is always scarce. And capital also creates scarcity through commodification of the entire world. And this is what John Bellamy Foster problematizes as paradox of wealth, or the Lauderdale paradox. It's about how the increase of private wealth is fundamentally characterized by the decline or decrease of public wealth. Because if we remember about the primitive accumulation, it's about dissolving the commons in order to create the private wealth. So from the beginning, from the very beginning, capitalism characterized by this creation of artificial scarcity. That's the first negation of capitalism. Primitive accumulation is the beginning of this creation of artificial scarcity for the sake of increasing private riches. And Marx quite consistently argues that the second negation, négation de négation, as the rehabilitation of the earth as commons. He says, but the capitalist production begets its own negation. This is the negation of the negation. It does not re-establish private property, but it does indeed establish individual property on the basis of the achievements of the capitalist era, namely cooperation and the possession in common of the earth, the erde, and the means of production produced by labor itself. So Marx is quite eco-socialist here, right? The earth, the erde, doesn't belong to anyone. It must be common. For example, in this passage here. But the problem is that there are some passages that's wealth, and that's the foundation of the abundant society. The post-scarcity society is about rehabilitating this abundance of genossenschaftlicher Reichtum.
All right. Welcome to another episode of Subversive History, an anti-colonialist, anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist stream. We are your hosts, Johnny, Pat, and today I think we're going to be finishing up The Divide by Jason Hickel, not Jackson Hinkle. And yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, I finished the book. Did you finish the thing? Did you finish everything up?
Yeah, I finished the whole thing up.
We'll be going over the last two chapters, as well as just kind of like an overall conclusion of the book, as well as making an announcement for the book that we will be beginning for our next stream coming next Wednesday. Did you want to get right into it, or do you want to take a second, or?
Yeah, let's just get right into it.
Okay. All right. There it is. Okay. So essentially, we're coming to the end portion here. Okay. Yeah. Second to last chapter is called From Charity to Justice. This would make some pretty interesting concluding arguments about like the nature of what is referring to as charity, but I guess you could apply this to like aid as more broadly, and not just the concept of aid, but aid as it exists today in a way of kind of like infantilizing and economically crippling global South nations and nurturing the dependence that they have on this aid. Obviously we can bring up a number of Thomas Sankara speeches where he attacks this mechanism directly. I know that we've already brought him up multiple times, and we've evoked that legacy quite a bit, and we will continue to. And Jason Hickel also does, and we will be visiting one of his Thomas Sankara quote that he utilizes to conclude his book, which I think is pretty interesting. Okay. So he begins this chapter talking about a parable which he learned living alongside public health workers, individuals that work in hospitals and other kind of first responder careers. And it goes along with a man who sees someone drowning in a river. And his initial thought is that he should jump in and save that person, which is a very natural and noble thought for if someone is to see someone drowning in a river. So as he's attempting to save this person, he notices that there is several more individuals floating down this river and also, potentially drowning. So his idea becomes, well, now I need to go get a couple of my friends, and now we're all going to jump in this river and try to save these people, into which he sees more and more people coming down the street. So then he gets the bright idea, well, maybe instead of jumping in this river to save this individual person, I should just go walk upstream and see what the source of all these people ending up in this river are. So he applies that initially to public health, which is a pretty common thing, is treating the symptoms, treating the causes and not treating the symptoms. Is that you can always go around and you can alleviate symptoms, but symptoms will continue to persist until the root cause has been adequately treated. So he extrapolates that, which he learned from his father, who worked in the Swaziland health industry, and applied that to economics or poverty and poverty alleviation. So I think that's a pretty relevant and poignant allegory or metaphor to the situation.
Yeah, because like when you think about it, a lot of our like commodified healthcare, at least especially here in America, none of it's actually like preventative. It's always, well, now that we've caught it at like stage 3 or whatever, or like no matter what form of healthcare, whether you're going to the dentist or you're going to a cardiologist or you're going to just like a basic doctor, half the time it's not until like you're about to lose a foot or a finger that like, oh, now we have to step in and do something. By the way, it's going to cost like $1 million fucking dollars for you to get whatever it is you need fixed, even though like there was probably like so many stages up to that point where this could have been reversed or this could have been addressed. But that's just the nature of our healthcare. That's just the nature of like how we view healthcare. Right. Think about it, like one of the biggest prestige shows coming out of America for years was Breaking Bad, where a school teacher, gets diagnosed with cancer, so he has to like sell drugs and manufacture crystal meth in order to like fund his cancer treatment.
Yeah, absolutely. And then we take that that dynamic and we remove it from the public health care, or not just public health care, but the healthcare industry at large, and apply that to, I'll refer to it as an industry. I'll refer to it as a, mechanism, a dynamic that we have currently. And it's not just like broadly speaking, like economics, or like, should I say like the academic science of studying economics, but like apply it more broad or more specifically to what we currently exist in terms of a framework for how poverty is viewed, treated as if it was like some kind of an illness, and how that illness of poverty is being treated in a very symptomatic way as opposed to a causal way, that the ways that you could actually alleviate it causally to create very profound and significant improvement in the from the poverty, as opposed to offering some kind of lukewarm or nominal symptomatic treatments that only serve to prolong and in many ways aggravate the poverty illness.
Yeah, he even quotes like, I don't know if you want to do the Oscar Wilde poem that like he goes over. He said, as Oscar Wilde once pointed out, people's emotions are stirred more quickly than their intelligence. To quote Oscar Wilde, people find themselves surrounded by hideous poverty, by hideous ugliness, by hideous starvation. It is inevitable that they should be strongly moved by all this. Accordingly, with admirable intentions, they very seriously and very sentimentally set themselves to the task of remedying the evils that they see. But the remedies do not cure the disease, they merely prolong it. Indeed, the remedies are part of the disease. They try to solve the problem of poverty, for instance, by keeping the poor alive, but this is not a solution. It is an aggravation of the difficulty. The proper aim is to try and reconstruct society on such a basis that poverty will be impossible, and that the altruistic virtues have really prevented the carrying out of this aim, just as the worst slave owners were those who were kind to their slaves, and so prevented the horror of the system being realized by those who suffered from it, and understood by those who contemplated it. So the people who do most harm are the people who try to do most good. Charity degrades and demoralizes. Which, like, you know, we just spent an entire book going over how, you know, charity and aid, all it really does is supplant, like, you know, any methods or means for these places that are actually suffering from being able to build up their own productive forces and being able to prevent, you know, the very need for any of the aid or charity.
Absolutely. And it's really interesting to hear, you know, Irish writer, I believe poet was his name, Oscar Wilde, talk about this. Maybe it's like lesser known to some individuals that he was actually a pretty politically minded individual, an avowed socialist. And it's very evident in this quote from him here. And the book goes on to state that he goes a step further, that he argues that charity not only distracts our attention from the ultimate causes of poverty, from the rot at the center of the system, it also obscures the nature of the problem from those who suffer it. Charity can detract from people's ability to directly challenge the forces that degrade them in the first place and strips them of their political agency. By smoothing over the contradictions of a deeply flawed system, it allows the system to continue a little bit longer. Usually, this is unintentional on the part of the humanitarian, but sometimes charity is specifically designed with this end in mind. Some scholars have pointed out that food aid from the West, for example, is carefully calculated to prevent the worst famines, to ensure that people receive at least enough calories to stay alive, but otherwise, the injustices of the global economic system would become so apparent that its legitimacy would collapse and political upheaval would almost certainly ensue. To avoid this outcome, the more cynical among the rich are happy to channel some of their surplus into charity. Obviously, we can apply this directly to everything that we've been speaking about with these institutions that provide aid to these third world countries, but it's also kind of like a pretty common critique of like a social democracy type of system where the rich come to the conclusion that they cannot immiserate the poor to the point where they will become revolutionary. So they need to devise what is the appropriate amount of breadcrumbs that we can allocate to the poor people so that they are just satiated enough to not want to chop our heads off.
Pretty much.
And this is you could apply to like a country like the Congo, you know what I mean, where we require their 8-year-olds to work in our cobalt mines,
Right.
but also we need those 8-year-olds to be just nourished enough to be able to extract those precious minerals. So absolutely, I will support a NGO or a government or a otherwise governmental agency to be able to funnel, a small dividend of my profit margins, so that they can have some like rough millet or wheat to be able to consume, to function their little fingers, to be able to extract the cobalt and the lithium that I so desperately need for my electric car industry.
Yeah. Just enough calories for them to work in the mines, but not enough to do much else.
But not enough to like keep teeth in their mouth or to prevent malaria adequately, or any of the things that at least that I profess to believe in terms of poverty alleviation.
Right.
And then there's one last point here on the from the Oscar Wilde portion of the book. On this point, Wilde makes another critical intervention. It is immoral to use private property to alleviate the horrible evils that result from the institution of private property, he writes. It is both immoral and unfair. Here he draws our attention to yet another problem with the charity paradigm. To the extent that charity is enabled by the accumulation of surplus wealth, it can never be a meaningful solution, for the processes by which wealth is accumulated are those that produce poverty in the first place.
Yeah, he mentions like a couple different statistics later on about like Starbucks, you know, and their what the hell is it? What do you call it?
Sorry, dude. So, indeed, it is the approach that high-profile philanthropists like George Soros and the Rockefellers have taken: make mountains of money during the day, and in the evening, give a bit of it away to improve the lives of the poor. But we have to ask the difficult question: where do the riches come from in the first place? Much of Soros's wealth comes from currency speculation, which played a direct role in the 1997 Asian financial crisis that pushed millions of people into poverty. The Rockefeller Foundation won its riches from monopolies in the fossil fuel industry. In almost every case, we can find that the accumulation that sustains charity comes from processes that causes the very problems they purport to solve. Starbucks has given charity to help improve the health outcomes of poor people in Ethiopia's coffee-growing communities, but at the same time, the company stands accused of dramatically underpaying Ethiopian coffee growers. 2. Coca-Cola gives a bit of charity to help impoverished communities in Guatemala, but the firm has been accused of engaging in violent campaigns against trade union organizers in order to prevent wages on its Guatemalan sugar plantations from rising. Fairness is better than charity. In the absence of fairness, charity carries the whiff of a scam. The same argument applies to official Western aid. If the U.S. government wants to reduce global poverty, perhaps instead of doling out aid, it should work to end structural adjustment, the tax evasion system, and unfair trade laws, some of the major forces that cause poverty in the first place. Hey, Sam. What's up?
What's going on, Sam? Yeah, and these, like, you know, there's growing evidence, if not, like, I think it's already, like, been proven that Coca-Cola was absolutely behind, like, the anti-union Guatemalan death squads.
I know that most prominently in Colombia. I actually don't have a lot of information on what happened in Guatemala specifically. When I was in Guatemala at the Spanish school that I would visit throughout most of my stay, where I talked to a lot of they would have seminars about political issues in Guatemala and things like that. They had signs up that said "Killer Coke" and stuff like that. So regardless if it's in Colombia or Guatemala
or Puerto Rico,
there's a very poor reputation of Coca-Cola directly or indirectly financing or directing or suggesting violent action be taken against trade union organizers. And this is along the same lines as the Canadian mining companies, where, you know, there may not be a Canadian mining executive down in Guatemala with a gun that's shooting people, but just like with any unjust type of meddling in a country system, there will always be collaborators that seek to benefit from the overall immiserating enterprise in their country. You know, you look at this with rubber plantations in the Congo, where the Force Publique, which was made up of Congolese men and women, those are Congolese people that decided I should be the small percentage of this country that is able to buddy up and do the bidding of the Belgians rather than be the one that will suffer the greatest from them. So I will enrich myself by unifying with the colonizers. So when you see a lot of these murders that happen in Guatemala, for example, this Canadian mining company is speculating on some land that may have some gold or other, I'm not exactly sure the exact mineral. So obviously there's some Guatemalans that will benefit greatly from that situation. It would be a small percentage compared to the overall community that will suffer immensely because of its construction. But those will very gladly, or I should say, maybe not gladly, will easily conduct or arrange some type of a murder to occur as a result. So it happens down the line, but absolutely you can point the finger at these corporations as the driving factor. Did you want me to bring up some of these here? Did you have one specifically?
I think like, yeah, I don't know. I was just trying to find something that would be like related like to the Guatemala, like, you know, Coke. There's the interview with one of the union leaders.
Okay. Is that the
And
Ray
then-
Rogers one, or
That would be the Coca-Cola death squads in Guatemala. The diary claim one is from the AP.
okay. One moment?
But I don't know if you wanted to get too deep in the weeds with the George Soros thing, but that's like an article from People's World.
Oh, I'm not going to get too deep on Soros. I mean, Soros is a piece of shit. There's a book called A History of Social Revolutions in Asia. There's a 2-volume book on this, and I'm sorry, I don't want to waste time like looking it up
I get it. I
downstairs.
just know that because
The second volume of it goes into how George Soros almost like individually was responsible for bankrupting the nation of Thailand. I don't know if you've ever heard about that, but
I've heard like a little bit. I just know that like with everything going on with like Kanye and shit, I felt like it was a little topical to go over how like, you know,
yeah,
it just is coincidence, and he happens to have a history.
yeah.
Right?
Well, I mean, the reason I think it's important to highlight the terrible demonic nature of George Soros is that you may have someone like Kanye West saying certain things about him, making like anti-Semitic connections with the misdeeds of George Soros, and maybe if you don't realize, you might might not understand how to like have like a well-founded criticism of George Soros, or at least to understand like, how to differentiate why someone like Kanye West and those that espouse similar anti-Semitic jargon as him what is the difference between like their criticism of him, which they would say that like, George Soros, the reason he's different than someone like Bill Gates or, someone along those lines is because he's Jewish. Whereas it's like, no, we can offer a criticism of all of these individuals for relatively the same things, and it's a way that they yield economic power to immiserate people, most specifically in the third world. And I just know offhand, George Soros did this specifically insidiously in Thailand. There's a whole chapter in this book I have downstairs about it. But yeah, Thailand, George Soros. Right.
For people that want to think that like George Soros is like, funding like Antifa or any of this other like, really like unhinged shit. George Soros is like fervently anti-communist.
Mm-hmm.
Like he is no fan of any part of like any kind of like left-leaning anything.
Yeah. I mean, you're only going to find like the most illiterate, and that's like the most politically correct term that I'll use for the people that would buy into such theories as George Soros, like pulling the strings of Antifa or something along those lines. Yes. Politically, poli-sci illiterate, historically illiterate individuals. I mean, it takes a very cursory reading of George Soros's activities where you can draw very material conclusions about why he is such a terrible person, and it has nothing to do with him being Jewish.
Yeah, I'm pissed because I'm still waiting on my George Soros check. I went to plenty of protests, man, over the
years. There's a really funny video of it's like a total dub. Like it's just like a bunch of like it's an actual Antifa rally, but there's a dub over it where it makes it sound like they're chanting George Soros, where's our money?
Which is like so comical because like the Tea Party actually like the way that like they project onto like Antifa protests and all this other stuff, right, is like literally what happened with the Tea Party. Like people were like paid to get on a bus, right, given a pre-made sign and been like, here, this is what you're chanting about. We're gonna drop you off at like this public park or whatever, and like it was like literally how they think that like every other left-wing like protest happens. I don't think I've ever seen a sharp flag at a single other protest in my life, by the way.
I used to see sharp flag just going to shows when I was like a kid. I used
not
to
at a protest.
No, but yeah, that's just like a very like obvious audio dub over,
Yeah.
you know, an Antifa demonstration. I've seen that shared around YouTube, around Facebook, with like very earnest and sincere belief in that
Yeah.
act actually occurring. That not only is he disseminating his funds into Antifa, but that they've become scorn against him and are now taking to the street to call for their money.
There's a civil war going on with the left.
Yeah.
Like they're
Honeymoon's
they're generous
over.
donors.
The honeymoon's over, and Antifa wants their money.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I wonder how big we would blow up if we just went like that route altogether, just like, you know, completely faked being like two right-wing dudes talking about like, you know, just completely made up bullshit about like, you know, Antifa honeymoon.
That's what pretty much what Dave Rubin does, and that's pretty much what most of Blaze Media does. That's what Steven Crowder does.
Yeah.
Steven Crowder made an article about Adolf Hitler being a socialist where he quotes Strasser and attributes the quote to Hitler.
They would quote
Strasser. Where Strasser and some, what's the other one? There's Otto, and then the other one.
Oh, they're brothers though, right?
They're brothers, exactly.
Yeah.
There's Otto and the other one. They wrote some pamphlet like early on in the Nazi Party where they were like, we're anti-capitalists. You know, we don't believe in capitalism. Blah, blah. You know, obviously both of them were liquidated in the Night of the Long Knives by Adolf Hitler. But regardless, none of that context or nuance is applied to this. Steven Crowder just takes his quote and just puts it to Adolf Hitler and puts it in an article.
They were
and then quotes it in a YouTube video that has, I assume, millions of views.
It's funny that they were liquidated by the Nazi Party, considering they were pretty much like the Pat Socks of their time.
I never made that connection before. That like the Strasserists were like the OG Pat Socks.
Yeah, no, that's like literally one to one, man. That same shit, and like they both, you know, are wound up. They're both gonna get grinded up, man. Like,
yeah. God damn it, that's what used as like useful idiots, and then like fed into the meat grinder once their usefulness has been realized.
Yeah.
Just so that we don't get too off track, I'm going to play this video about the Guatemalan Coca-Cola situation. Just if you're listening and you needed a reminder of why we're playing this, is that it's a take on poverty and charity specifically. So you might have Coca-Cola who you know, operates some charitable foundation or contributes to some charitable foundation because they are concerned about Guatemalan poverty, but it is a gesture of futility because the very practices by which that they are gaining their millions and billions and billions in income is the exact method by which that Guatemalan communities are becoming impoverished. And this you know, little piecemeal charity that they're returning back to the communities pales in comparison to the processes by which that they're immiserating the Guatemalan communities.
Coca-Cola company has been for us in Guatemala a symbol of oppression, of exploitation of the Guatemalan workers, of disrespect for human rights, for human dignity.
The workers revived the EXA union in 1975. Marta Torres was forced into exile for her participation. In 2 years' time, 8 Coca-Cola union leaders were murdered, one by one.
Since the beginning of the organization, the struggle was very violent. The first time that the company's employer approached us was to tell us that the owner of the franchise didn't want a union, that if the workers wanted a union, what they would have instead would be blood.
The bloodshed of the late 70s caught the world's eye. Coca-Cola refused responsibility for the problems of local owners.
So yeah, just a quick little illustration of the hypocritical methods by which these major companies seek to extract wealth and give the lowest wages possible to people that work for them in Guatemala or Colombia or insert global south country here, whether it's a sweatshop or a lithium mine or a coca field, or I say coca field. I don't know how much is even, I don't know how much of that is, we can direct that to Coca-Cola. That was just a weird word association in my mind between Coca and Coca-Cola. But you get the idea.
Maybe if we start putting cocaine back into Coca-Cola.
Yeah. It's mysterious how all these left-leaning union community owners end up dead. Yeah.
Kind of weird, huh?
Crazy statistic one time that about how many union workers die each year, or it's like each day or something like that. No. I can't get into this right now. Maybe one day I can find that statistic. But we're going to have to move past it. I just can't pull it up right now. It's like a very staggering statistic about how many union organizers die each day in South America. So that kind of brings us from the beginning of this chapter, where we establish this hypocritical nature of charity as it exists, or at least the way that it's being utilized in the world currently. And then really what this chapter is like an itemized compilation of Jason Hickel's solutions to the problems that he catalogs throughout this entire book. So most of this book is a critique. It's an identification of systems of poverty and how they're perpetuated. This last portion is a number of proposals which he's assembled as to how that can be alleviated. So the first one is debt resistance. And obviously you can look to individuals such as Patrice Lumumba and Thomas Sankara, who we have brought up consistently in this podcast, whatever you want to call it, podcast stream. We bring up Thomas Sankara consistently for a number of reasons, but one of them is that he made a very early and a very educated, and as the years go on, it proves to be more and more visionary attack on Western institutions imposing debts and continuing to impose these debts and the interests that they've accumulated on third world countries, and which is keeping them in a state of perpetual debt servitude. So obviously this is a major issue as it pertains to the third world, and that is mainly because a lot of these countries are contributing 50% of their annual GDP to pay back debt. There's a lot of factors here that I want to go over that he goes over here. So let's just get into it now, because I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, because there's a couple of very, very key points here as to why this debt situation is so nonsensical and also damaging to these individual countries. One moment. So when reactionaries talk about how communism never works, I'm like, what the fuck? Do you not know they're actively murdering, suppressing the left? Yeah, and this also, I don't know if you know there's a Perenni quote where he's like, when they say communism doesn't work, he's like, but what about when it did work?
Yeah,
that's like the quote. He's like, it's been working for millions of people.
Well, honestly, when it does work,
to me, I actually would retaliate with the question: name one country that has had communism or like a communist government, let's say socialism, established that did not result in a overall net positive enhancement of its population's living conditions, calorie intake, many of these social metrics. I mean, Johnny, can you think of any?
Wait, repeat the question.
Yeah. So when someone says this, like what Sam is saying, communism never works, I would say, can you name a single country where socialist policies weren't implemented, where metrics such as living standard as a whole had a net enhancement, calorie intake went up, preventable diseases where
Yeah, all the good shit, right? Yeah, it doesn't matter, right, Patrick? Because at the end of the day, they were authoritarian, okay? What about like?
But I mean,
freedom?
you can't look at the history of the Soviet Union where you can't say that things got worse as the socialist societies progressed. You can't say they got worse in Vietnam. You can't say they got worse in China. You can't say they got worse in Cuba. You know what I mean? You can find in many ways where certain things were problematic that probably deserve to be criticized.
Those places suck. How would you even know? You've never even been there.
It's okay. So I didn't say whether you would want to live there. I simply said, was their life better than prior to the implementation of a socialist system? And I think you're going to be hard pressed. I'm sure there's examples out there, but the main ones that are generally referred to, you can't really say that the individual lives of citizens have not been enriched through having like nationalistic and socialistic policies applied to them. And I don't think you he called you out by your government, Pat. Yeah. So yeah, I'm just curious. I mean, if you can name any, I'm sure there's some. Like, I'm honestly like, you might be able to say, I don't know what happened in Cambodia under Pol Pot. Honestly, I would make a lot of argumentation regarding his philosophical underpinnings as he went on that project, and I would also look at how China and Vietnam resisted him. Or opposed him, right, and the Khmer Rouge. So, maybe you could point at that. Maybe you could point at Gonzalo in Peru. You know what I mean? There's plenty of people that, nominally refer to themselves as socialists that I would disagree with the way that they implemented things. But in the main ones that we generally talking about that take like a Marxist approach to organizing their economy, it's very difficult from my estimation, to find one that was a resounding failure. You can point at things like, certain famines that happened. You can point at things like maybe a certain purge that occurred or something like that you can say was egregious or was excessive, but that still does not repudiate that the overall life of the individual citizens did not get better.
I mean, like, look, there are plenty of examples that I can think of off the top of my head that you didn't even mention yet. Well, if it's a fantasy, God damn it. All right, let's see. Well, if it's a fantasy land and we have replicators and transporters and people won't use money no more than a utopia is possible, like socialism.
This person isn't even engaging with what I'm saying. It's like one of those things where you can't really pin them down to a specific point because they're in chat and they're just going to respond. I've made my claim more and more concise, and they're just going to keep sidestepping it and saying different things. So it's like really pointless. Like, I think I made my point. I think there's evidence that supports my point. I'm open to a refutation of that, and I'm open that there's probably exceptions to the rule.
No, that's the thing, though, is that like you don't actually know what socialism is by your response.
I actually can I ask you something, Johnny? And I don't even mean to say this in a way that makes me look good or anything like that. Do you know what they're referring to when they say replicators and transporters?
It's some fucking Star Trek bullshit. Like, and that's another thing is that Star Trek isn't even fucking socialism. Star Trek is literally just post-scarcity.
Well, also a no money utopia stuff. Like, this is just stuff that like even Marx, discussed back in the 1800s. I mean, this is something that is like literally foundational to like the socialist tradition, that we're not utopians. Socialism has nothing to do with no money. Maybe some point hundreds of years in the future, as socialism has run its course, that we can actually like go through some type of a hypothetical paradigm shift as a society to where maybe some of those features of society are no longer necessary. But I don't think any logical socialist is envisioning some moneyless utopia. We're gonna individually section off one country, and we're gonna abolish the commodity form, and we're gonna abolish wages, and we're gonna abolish everything, and now we have like a perfect little communist island. I mean, it's just silliness that no one advocates for.
Yeah, I have no idea how to pronounce their screen name either, so I'm just gonna go with DSA. Look, DSA. It's not even that like we don't want a response from you. It's just that you're moving the goalposts of where the conversation.
Yeah, because my overall point is that you can't deny that in the Soviet Union, in China, in Vietnam, in Laos, in Cuba, you can even point to places like Bolivia, things like this. If you want to get move outside of like it depends on what you actually refer to as socialism, which is fine, but you can evidently and factually validate that people's lives got better. If you look at the way that people lived
Right.
in 1917 versus how they lived in 1950, I'm not even trying to go all the way to like today or anything like that. I'm saying in a few short decades, you can see a radical improvement in lives. You can see this in China. You can see this in Cuba. You can see this in Vietnam. You can replicate this over and over again. This is my point. And then you said something like, then you don't want to live there. That had nothing to do with my original point, whether you would want to live there or not. Personally, I've been to Cuba a couple times. I don't really want to live there. You know what I mean? I absolutely approve of Cuba and support whatever they can do to enrich themselves, but it doesn't really have anything to do with my initial claim.
Right. It's like, anybody that asked me, like, well, why don't you move to Venezuela?
Why don't you move to Burkina Faso as it exists? Why don't you move to the Congo? Why don't you move to Bangladesh?
Because my whole family's here and I love them. And like,
not you. I'm talking about people who are like, they're like, if you like capitalism so much, why don't you move to a capitalist country? It's like, okay, move to Burkina Faso.
Right.
As it exists today.
All right, just give me like 1 second. I got to get all this hot honey that's like still on my hands.
Yeah, that's fine. Too many contradictions in capitalism. We're headed to where the rubber meets the road because of it. I'm willing to bet that you think it's solely because we never actually tried pure cap. So yeah, and this is another thing, Sam, is that I see this a lot with individuals, especially like the Yaron Brook. I'm sorry, I forget his name. He's a very prominent libertarian media personality. They apply a double standard to socialism and capitalism, whereas socialism will be crucified for all of the excesses and atrocities that have been committed in its name, which there are some that we need to contend with as socialists. But then anytime that you look at a capitalist country and say, oh, look what they did, they would say, oh, well, that's not real capitalism. That the state had something to do with that. So thus, if there was no state, then it would be more capitalist and that wouldn't happen. And it's like they only will attack these issues from an idealized utopian perspective with a economic system that has never been implemented anywhere in the world. Whereas socialists, I feel, are much more willing to accept and contend with the things that went wrong in the past. I don't look at the Soviet Union and say, oh, that has nothing to do with what I believe. Like, I understand that that's a piece of socialist history, and we need to study it. We need to contextualize it, and we need to understand where things did not go, went to a place that should never be replicated. Exactly. I'm in oblivion.
No more honey.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So yeah, here, you want to yell at these guys for a second while I pee?
Yeah. Go for it. What the fuck is this? What are we doing now?
Nothing's I think they're done. I don't think they're gonna say anything else. We're just talking. I'm just talking with Sam at this point. Oh, but I do have. I guess I will make.
I don't understand why all these countries, despite being bombed into oblivion and money being poured into anti-revolutionary forces, why they always fail. But that's another thing, is that, like, I don't think a lot of people ever consider, like, what is a failure, because, I'm sure if you asked Ronald Reagan, right, what his opinion was on Chile, he would probably say it was a resounding success. I'm sure that, like, Nixon, under, like, every coup that happened under him would say that, like, it was a raging success. For, like, the first, 10 years after the Soviet Union was forcibly dissolved, I'm certain if you asked a majority of U.S. like pundits and thinkers, they would say that, like, capitalism in the former Soviet Union is a resounding success. Even though, like, you have so much loss of life, so much the quality of life for people in that country just plummeting into the fucking core of the planet.
Yeah. A point that I was making, I was curious how you feel about this. Like, I was saying, based on this here, I'll pull it up. Too many contradictions in capitalism. Okay, but I'm willing to bet that you think it's solely because we never actually tried pure capitalism. That's why it's not working. So this is a person that accused us of being utopian, and then, like, this is something that I can't, like, there's this constant accusation towards socialists that we are utopian, that we believe,
Right.
we by human nature, and we believe that some utopian system can exist. But a lot of time, when you speak to somebody that's a capitalist, especially like a higher personality capitalist in the public light, and they are like maybe like somebody that's Ayn Rand, what's that called, the Ayn Rand Institute or whatever, like those type of individuals, they will very clearly crucify the socialist tradition based on excesses or atrocities that were carried out in its name. But if you say, okay, well, what about what happened in the Belgian Congo? What about what happened in Nazi Germany? What about what happened in any number of these places where colonialism, imperialism, neo-colonialism, starvations hit, like throughout the starvations that hit throughout India, whether it was in the 1940s Bengali famine, or the ones that happened decades before that during the colonial process, and converting it into a cash crop economy. Essentially, what they will say is, "Oh, well, that was the state that did that." So, if capitalism was allowed, that's not capitalism. So it's like how there's a common thing where they say that's not real socialism, which no actual socialist ever says. I mean, at least not me. I know me or you wouldn't point at something bad, a famine that happened in China, and say, "Well, that's not real socialism." I'll own that. Right. I'll say that there was problems in China and there was a fucking famine in China, and we need to contend with that. It is our duty as socialists and supporters of the socialist tradition to own the historical blunders of socialism and understand where we should not be replicating things. But it seems like
we have some L's.
We took some L's, but it seems like capitalism just like play this game of like all things good were because of capitalism and all things bad were because of socialism. So like even if you like look at like Norway or something like that, they're like, that's not socialist, that's capitalist. And it's like, okay.
Forget the Nordics. Just do China, because they do the same shit with China. They say that every
they'll crucify China for being the most death. It's the death factory of famine and all this stuff and blah 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 blah. And that's socialism. But then when you say, oh well, China's like one of the leading countries in the world right now on many metrics, and they're like, that's because of the capitalism part.
So long as the U.S. remains like the hegemon of the world, so long as it is unipolar and America remains like, the king of the castle, right, in his chair, right? Yeah, sure. We will never achieve pure communism, whatever the fuck that even is, right?
It's an abstract tangent at this point. Like, obviously, it's something that I think even the least, Marxist individual, if you ask them what the future should look like, they will describe communism. Like, they won't call it communism, but if you say like, man, what should the world look like? Let's say we make a bunch of technological advancements, and what will the world look like in the year 3000? And they'll be like, oh man, like everything's just going to be automated, and like we won't have to pay for anything. Like there'll just be a lot of food because technology has solved all that stuff. And it's like, essentially, that would be the moneyless and stateless and classless society.
Yeah. Look, we're not heading for Star Trek. We're heading for like fucking Mad Max meets like, fucking Children of Men. All right. That's where the hell we're going. Okay. Because like every time I see one of these like, dystopian future movies where like they got like flying cars and shit, but like everybody's living in poverty, it's like, no. We're not going to make it that far. As of right now, that is a pipe dream.
But by right now, we'd be lucky if most of the people here can survive on this planet, can survive past 2050.
Yeah, we'll be lucky if like most of us, right, and most of the people that we know that like should live into their 70s will make it past like their 50s, because like the next 20 fucking years are going to be so incredibly unstable, right? Due to climate change, which we're going to get to later.
Everyone's going to drown in the rising waters. It's the wars that are going to ensue because of resource scarcity and because of migration. You think we have a bad issue with migrants now? Wait until these ecological factors continue to increase and people find that their countries or their cities are no longer livable.
Right. And or wait until most of the breadbasket of the world, where like, we grow most of the things that we need, not even just to like feed people, but also feed livestock, right? And also for like biofuels and shit, right? Just wait till that's like no longer arable. right?
It's so great. These people, man, that just like they just come in here with their like dollar store communist criticisms that they heard from like Dave Rubin or Steven Crowder or any of the people that I talked shit about earlier in this thing, and they just come in and they're like, oh, that would never work. But I wouldn't live there. Why don't you move there? It's like the same shit. It's like, dude, like do you use your brain at all to think about any of these things?
Right.
But
So
let's get back into it because I don't want to get too off the rails here. If they come back, we'll contend with it when it needs to. But so debt resistance. Okay, I don't know if you guys remember, we were talking about debt resistance and how toxic international debt is, and we talked about Thomas Sankara as we always do. But let's continue. Perhaps the most important first step to abolish the debt burdens of developing countries. This move is crucial in a number of respects. It would roll back the remote control power that rich countries exercise over poor countries. Look at Thomas Sankara in the 1980s. He was calling it essentially exactly this, and restore sovereign control over economic policy at the national level. It would also free developing countries to spend more of their income on healthcare, education, and poverty reduction efforts instead of just handing it over in debt service to big banks. Again, you can look at a country like Lebanon that pays 50% of its national budget annually on debt repayment, whereas it only pays about 24% towards nutrition and education or healthcare programs. I think it's healthcare programs and education programs for its citizens. And then we expect, then we sit here and we wonder, well, why isn't the poverty situation improving? It's really not that granule of a issue to investigate. It's there pretty easily in the ones and twos.
We're all just trying to figure out who did this. All right,
and that's the thing too. It's like, man, we just can't figure it out. Why are they so poor? Oh man, if only there was like some new NGO that can go over there and like tell us like, why does this keep happening? It must be because they're corrupt. It must be because they're not bred of the European, that they don't know how to handle their resources and budget their money and not be corrupt swindlers with their own resources. This is the underlying implication by most of these Eurocentric apologists.
Right.
Okay. This will be a difficult battle, of course, since creditors stand to lose a great deal. Some that are overexposed to debt in heavily indebted countries might even go bankrupt. But that is a small price to pay for the liberation of potentially hundreds of millions of people. If we abolish the debts, nobody dies. The world will carry on. Debts don't have to be repaid. In fact, they should be repaid when doing so means causing widespread human suffering. So this is like, won't somebody think of the Simpsons thing with
Won't somebody think of the multi-trillionaire banks and business?
How can we let Burkina Faso not pay its debts? So
I mean, like, what the fuck is it? Earlier in the book, he's talking about how, like, I mean, like, if we actually like break down how much the loan was that they took out, they've already repaid it. Well, actually, they're just paying back interest at this point.
That's coming up. So then there's a very interesting kind of like just like a framing question. That debt is currently referred to as forgiveness. Like we shouldn't be talking about this, that incurring debt is a sin and it requires forgiveness. When in reality, debt was imposed and was, a form of sophisticated gunboat diplomacy, let's call it. What I mean? We can take the gunboat diplomacy that occurred in Japan and Korea in the late 1800s and just put a fresher face on it and call it debt imposition. Right. So let's talk about some of the specifics of debt and why this dynamic is so hypocritical in its aims and damaging in its practice. As of 2008, some $95 million worth of global South debt was scheduled for some degree of relief. That sounds like a lot, but economists at the New Economics Foundation have found that in order to achieve real debt sustainability and to allow enough budget space for countries to eradicate poverty, it needs to be increased by a factor of 6. Another recent report finds that at least $400 billion of debt in 100 different countries needs to be canceled simply so that states can have enough money to meet the basic needs of their citizens. So we can calculate that just to meet basic needs, we need to forgive, or should I say cancel, $400 billion in 100 different countries just so that they can survive. They cannot go on meeting the basic needs of their citizens with this cumbersome debt imposition. Both of these studies provide simple Both of these studies provide sensible starting points for any debt cancellation program. Another approach is to cancel what are known as dictator debts, debts racked up by heads of state with no democratic mandate. Dictator debts presently amount to about $735 billion in 32 different countries. Canceling them would free citizens from having to repay loans that they never agreed to pay in the first place and which probably never benefited them. So if you weren't here in the previous streams, I pulled up factual evidence of this happening in the case of Chile with Pinochet, with Mobutu in the Congo, with Rios Montt in Guatemala, and the list would go on and on and on. You can probably find this in any of those countries where you find in Killing Hope, where there was some kind of a coup orchestrated by the United States. You can probably find the person that they put in power would ultimately request very large loans from Western financial institutions. So now we've also established this concept of dictator debt and how insane it is to pass the debt of a kleptocratic dictator onto the innocent civilians of a poor and starving nation. Alternatively, we could approach debt cancellation from a more general angle. Many developing countries have debt burdens that are primarily piles of interest. And this is what you were referring to, Johnny. For example, if a country took out $5 billion in loans in 1980 at 10% interest and then repaid $500 million each year, by the year 2000, they would have paid back a total of $10 billion. That's twice as much as the initial loan, and would still have more debt to repay, simply because of the power of compound interest. In light of this, we might suggest that poor countries below a certain development threshold have already paid their debts plus the equivalent of a modest rate of interest, say 2 to 3% per year at most, enough to cover the creditors' inflation losses, deserve to have the rest of their debt burden written off. This would be the same thing as retroactively imposing interest rate caps on already existing loans to make them more affordable. So in many cases, because of these very lucrative interest rates that are imposed on these loans, a lot of these countries would have already paid this back if it wasn't for the compounding interest.
But that's the whole idea behind this entire system, is that like it's not so much so that like these countries can even get loans or any of that other crap. It's literally to just keep them subjugated, to keep them consistently and constantly in perpetuity paying back these debts, so that they can never actually realize any of those protectionist policies that they started to put in place back in the 60s and the 70s. Mm-hmm. Or was it like the 50s and the 60s, and like the 70s was like the age of the coup? Whatever. Point is, you know what I mean, right? It's all of this is just designed so that none of these solutions that we're about to go over can ever happen peacefully.
Okay. So did you have a specific video you wanted me to play here?
Oh no! I just wanted to share.
Okay, I have it all. I have it all.
If you see anything that looks relevant, like
But also bring it up when you have the chance, because sometimes I'm looking at different screens. So if there's something that specifically important. So the next one, that was one of the biggest ones that I brought there. One moment. Okay, actually, I have a couple.
Thank you, Hashkush, for the 100-bit or whatever those are. Cheers.
What is cheer?
It's some Twitch thing. I think it's like, I think it's money.
Oh wow!
I don't know if it's money or not, but like, thank you, Hashkush, regardless.
Yeah, I actually have a couple things here that I completely forgot. I'm getting so caught up in the conversation. Biddies. So just here's some the New Economics Foundation. This is the group that was cited by Jason Hickel. Did I say his name right?
What is that?
Oh, okay. I thought you were laughing because I said Jackson Hinkle or something like that.
No. It's Sam correct us. It is in fact money. Thank you for the money, Hatchcrash. You can tell how like financially invested we are in this, because like it's honestly it's the information, right? It's the material that we want to cover that's like way more important. Like we really don't give a shit about making money doing this.
Yeah. Like I said, like we said before, we would have turned off the ads if we had the opportunity to, but apparently you just can't. So debt relief as if justice mattered, a framework for a comprehensive approach to debt relief that works. So this is just a publication from the New Economics Foundation that talks about a lot of these situations. Some countries are spending more than twice their education and health budgets on debt service. For example, Lebanon, I quoted this example earlier, spends 52% of its government budget on debt service compared to 23% on health and education combined. 6 times the level of credit relief currently available under global initiatives to reduce the debt of the heavily indebted poor countries is needed if all countries are to achieve debt sustainability, a level of debt that protects government spending needed to meet basic human development needs, as well as not taxing those people who already live below the poverty line. Debt relief, as if just it mattered, gathers together and updates research previously published by the Jubilee Research Program at NEF and makes the case for a comprehensive new approach for debt relief for the world's most indebted nations. So you can download the whole report here. Obviously, we're already going over one book. We can't go over, this entire thing just to substantiate the one claim from the one paragraph that I'm talking about right now. But if anybody wants to, New Economics Foundation, it's there. So now just another piece on that. Financing the global sharing economy, part 3, cancel unjust debt. So this is another report here. Obviously, we're not going to go into the entire report, but we can go over the key points. The unconditional cancellation of all unjust and unpayable developing country debts is essential to achieve more equitable distribution of the world's financial resources. Governments in low and middle income countries are indebted to the tune of over $4 trillion and spend more than $1.4 billion every day repaying these debts. On average, developing countries are returning over 400% more in debt service repayments than they receive in aid. Campaigners demand that at least $400 billion should be canceled for around 100 countries if they are to meet the basic needs of their citizens. However, canceling illegitimate dictator debts alone, estimated at $735 billion, could free up $81 billion a year for developing countries. Current progress on debt cancellation remains dangerously slow. A new international debt workout mechanism is urgently needed to resolve sovereign debt crisis and disputes in a fair and transparent manner. Lastly, there is also an urgent need for stronger rules that will ensure more responsible lending and borrowing in the future in order to prevent the accumulation of further unsustainable and illegitimate debts.
Rule-based order.
Yeah. So there's obviously very here deeply to the nitty-gritty of everything. We don't have time to do that now, but here is the information if you are so inclined to check that out.
It's from 2012. They've made a lot of headway in 10 years.
And the last one was from 2018, the one from the New Economic Foundation. So that is the basis of debt cancellation, that not only is it possible, but it's practical and it's ethical in many respects, that it's not even logical to force people to continue paying back debts that are so far above the principal loan that they took out, as well as loans that were taken out by ruthless autocratic dictators that used a good amount of the money to enrich themselves as opposed to improve the infrastructure of the country. And we, at the expense of these countries, have extracted many, many, many billions, trillions of dollars for the enrichment of our own domestic institutions. So all that needs to be taken into play here. That debt cancellation is not some kind of like, oh, they just want a free ride, and there's some kind of like weird cosmic obligation that they have. If you take a loan, you pay back a loan. Whatever some chud might say to you, there's very, very strong evidential precedent for this to happen. Because I know it might sound like economically illiterate to be like, just forgive the debt. But no, there's actually quite a bit of evidence here that suggests that that's exactly what needs to happen.
Right. And he then goes into talking about alternative means or institutions for these countries to turn to outside of just, the IMF, the World Bank, or something to do with the World Trade Organization that has obviously proven itself in its foundation to be predatory. Right. He talks about how the New Development Bank, founded by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa in 2015, might provide just such an alternative. So too might the new Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, founded by China in 2016. And I'm getting to that, Sam. How China forgave 17 African nations debt this past year. All right. He also says, so these new banks could end up projecting the economic and geopolitical interests of their founding nations over other regions of the global south. In other words, they might function as a tool of, quote, sub-imperialism. which I could not help but highlight with a giant what the fuck in the margins is sub-imperialism. Like, someone tell me like what the definition of sub-imperialism is and how it differentiates itself from just regular old classic formula imperialism. Because like I don't get it. And like Sam brought up, China has time and again forgiven the debts of, 17 different African nations. There's even nations like, within Central and South America that they have forgiven the debts to. They have proven themselves, very amenable to like defaulting on debt. There's even like a famous clip of Giannis Varoufakis. Yeah.
Someone in the audience asked, like, I think they're like, should we be worried about this? And like, he kind of scoffs. He's actually very dismissive of this, and he pretty much scoffs him. No, we have nothing to worry about there. I'm a big fan of Giannis. I think that obviously we should be very critical in our understanding of the way that these loans go out, and understand that the dynamic is always there for this type of methodology to turn predatory. So we should always be aware that this could, be harmful. And there's plenty of evidence of Chinese companies doing negative things, even through some of the previous chapters here with the companies themselves.
Thank you for the link, Sam. I actually have debated whether or not to use that podcast as like the first half hour of our episodes that we always use for some kind of video that's related to a lot of like what we'll be talking about, right? And I debated using that audio from that podcast as like part of our like, first half hour sort of introductory thing. It's the Crane, Pat. It's an Africa-China podcast, and they talk a lot about like the relationship between China and Africa.
Did you ever play this Professor Wolf video, or
how long is it? I forgot to check.
It's 7 minutes and 26 seconds.
I mean, it's up to you. Do you want to spend 7 minutes watching it?
I think we're already past the debt relief thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Do you want to watch it? If you do, I don't want to like steamroll you or anything like that.
No, you're not steamrolling me. It's just it's mostly I feel like we've talked about this like to death, and like like I was quoting out of the book before, the new development bank of like Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. That's I think BRICS. That what's up, Liar Judas? That's the thing that like what's his name? The D, fucking Richard Wolff. Like he's always like talking about BRICS. So if you want to know more about BRICS, I would definitely like check that out. I'm more interested personally in the new what is it? Shanghai Cooperative Association thing. That thing that like China just started with, like Russia and Iran just joined, and I think a couple other he loves his BRICS. He loves his co-ops and his BRICS.
He loves Mondragon and BRICS.
Yes, Mondragon, BRICS, co-ops. You say
and
co-op
Hinkle.
3 times in a mirror.
Okay, so the next section. So we just covered the first section that of solutions posited by Jason Hickel. The next is global democracy, and essentially what he's saying here is that the World Bank, the IMF, and the World Trade Organization have an undue amount of control over the global financial system, and that these juggernaut financial institutions are headed exclusively by Western presidents and Western constituents, and even the ones that do incorporate a system of nominal democracy have almost an exclusive veto power with the United States. So even if there was a complete alliance between global South nations to repudiate some of the systems that they're subject to through these institutions, it could still not amount to an over 50% margin in terms of the voting process. We covered this more extensively when we went over the specific chapter. Essentially what he's saying here is that Global South countries need fair and equal representation in these institutions to give them a real say in the formulation of policies that affect them. No real studies to go into here or anything that's really necessary. Just they need a better seat at the table. That's really what it comes down to, is that these institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, and the World Trade Organization are undemocratically and almost in a sense unilaterally, despite some like lip service that they play to democracy, enforcing economic policies on this country, and that needs to stop. On these countries, and that needs to stop.
I have one criticism of this. This section that he says the secretive tribunals that decide the fate of countries accused of breaking trade rules that harm them could be open to scrutiny, allowing public media to assess whether the rules and penalties stand up to common sense notions of fairness. If you open up these secretive tribunals, right, to like the media, right, I'm willing to bet money 9 times out of 10 the U.S. is going to already have a manufactured plot, a completely, totally fictitious, invented narrative that like most of the world, at least the Western world, right, will believe, let alone the American public. They already do this so many times with every other goddamn fucking thing. Why wouldn't they do this with like instead of secretive tribunals, deciding the fate of countries accused of breaking trade rules? Like they'll just be like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like I understand like his solutions that he offers like throughout like this chapter. It's just that there's like a lot of it where it's just like, that's very optimistic that like there would be no resistance to this.
I don't think at any point of this he says that there would be no resistance. I mean, I think that if you make a book of accusations and problems, that it's only right that you say, well, how would you alleviate these? Well, ideally, this is what I would do, and this is what I believe that there's evidence to suggest would do a lot to improve these things.
True. Okay. Yeah.
And he highlights a number of individuals that were literally murdered trying to do this. So I think that could happen. But I see where you're coming from. I understand what you're saying.
Yeah. I just feel like there should be just a little bit more like, not poignancy, but just a little bit more dwelling on that like, but it's a shame that anybody that has attempted to do these things gets murdered or anybody that like dying in mysterious circumstances.
Sorry, my girlfriend just very sneakily brought me a drink, and she snuck it over with her hand so she couldn't be seen on the camera.
It's okay. When the Subversive wives make their own Twitch stream,
we'll debut them one day.
Their Twitch stream is just gonna like take off, and ours are still gonna be like our loyal fans that will abandon us for our wives.
Cheers! I drink my seltzer water in their memories.
I drink my mysterious liquid out of a pasta sauce jar.
So the next section is titled "Just Wages," meaning justified wages, and this is like a pretty revolutionary concept, but also a very obvious solution. Like, it sounds crazy when you bring, and radical when it gets brought up, but then when you think about it in actuality, it's extremely practical and makes perfect sense. And this is a globalized wage standard. The way that we set a minimum wage for a country, we set a global minimum wage. And the global minimum wage follows a couple of criteria as to how it could be stipulated. So setting a globalized wage standard at 50% of median wage per nation. So you take any nation in the country, in the world, you look at what is the median wage. The minimum wage can be no less than 50% less than that. Secondly, all minimum wages need to be above the national poverty line, which is something that is very, very, very seldomly adhered to in global South countries. It's customary for large corporations, sweatshops, plantations, mines for minerals to pay daily or even weekly or monthly salaries that are well below the national poverty line. And this would see.
We have like whole ass states that right here in the U.S. that like do not what's the word, like follow rules regarding like a minimum wage, or they find some kind of loophole or something, in order to get out of it. It's kind of like how like service workers and shit that rely mostly on tips but are paid like $2 an hour.
Yeah, right, exactly. Which is like, you're literally just offsetting wages to the customer, and that's
right.
federally acceptable as well. Is that businesses can be like, well, I want to pay them as least as possible, so I'll put the burden on you to pay for it. You don't have to, but do you want her? I guess you don't want her kids to eat.
Yeah. If you're just a guiltless sociopath,
I on the other hand, the entrepreneur, I am infinitely ethical in my exploitation of this server.
Man,
fuck Sonic. How about that? The Subversive History Interactive Podcast is taking a principled and stern opposition to Sonic as a organization.
Except for that one that had that fucking hardcore show down in like Central or South Jersey. Yo, that was fucking lit.
ASAB. Man, there's a whole like meta wine discussion going on in our chat. Which is like funny on one hand, but also endearing in another, because it means that our community is growing to some degree that like there can be like side conversations happening. Like that there's enough people here that like they can have their own conversations on the side.
I'm all here for it.
Yeah. As someone who considers myself like a pretty petty bourgeois guy at this point, because like I work from home in like a clerical, like administrative capacity at this point, I earned my stripes in the restaurants, in the kitchens, and the dish pits, and everything like that. So,
bro, I
was grinding out.
Dishwasher.
My first job was McDonald's. Before getting into like working in substance abuse treatment, I had worked for 2 years in the dish pit of a steakhouse. Like I spent years just in those types of take the easiest money you can get. Yeah. Well, no, I mean, I'm still definitely part of like a laboring class. I sell my labor in exchange for wages, but I also don't delude myself into being like I'm the same as a factory worker or a farmer, or I still kind of look at my lifestyle as a relatively petty bourgeois lifestyle, just because I don't like being like putting on worker face. You know what I mean? Like, because that's what it feels like sometimes. Like that, like I advocate for workers globally, but I also understand that I live in a pretty posh position compared to them. And though I do sell my labor for a wage, I don't toil the field for 12 hours.
No, I mean, like, dude, then again, I worked retail for like 10 years. And like I don't think there is anything that like makes you just like give up on humanity faster.
I'm not even saying retail is exactly. I'm saying where you see me here doing this podcast, this is where I work.
Yeah.
So that's different than retail. At least you have to go. My job is more comfortable than a retail job.
Petty bourgeois Pat.
I'm just being serious. I'm just being critical of my own position. And like I said, I feel like some people in like the socialist movement put on worker face a little too much. Somebody like Vosh or something like that is like, we're workers because you're a streamer or something like that. And it's like, dude, shut up.
Yeah, I guess like I'm a social worker now, right? But like fucking, I worked all kinds of jobs. I've worked at a zoo. I've worked at fucking I remember working at Blockbuster. I've worked.
better than petty bourgeois. A labor aristocracy is probably more appropriate term for what I'm part of. Because to be a petty bourgeois, I would just have to like own something, but it would have to be very menial what I own, right? Like if I owned like a little cafe and I made like about as much as like your average like laborer in terms of like take home profits, that's like a petty bourgeois. But like a labor aristocracy is just like on like a higher echelon of like the labor force, right?
Yeah, you'd have to like get like an Etsy and then have your girlfriend being like, making shit.
I would have to be profiting off of wage labor to be petty bourgeois, but just not astronomically doing so where I'm like a major capitalist that like, sits back and does nothing. Like there's obviously, like I live in Philadelphia, there's obviously someone up the street that owns a coffee shop that owns it and also does contribute some labor to it as well as owning it.
Some.
And that would be more petty bourgeois. Absolutely, 1,000%. And this is absolutely something that we've been covering through this book, is that, my standard of living is enhanced by current and historical exploitation of the global South. Looking at it in a national vacuum or a domestic vacuum is a very simplistic way that I think a lot of people like. This is kind of like the iPhone thing, you know what I mean? Like where people are like, oh, you're a socialist, but you have an iPhone.
Have iPhone.
Yeah. And like that's kind of like the kind of simplistic thing. And it's like, yeah, I have an iPhone because people are being like ruthlessly exploited. And it's not even necessarily me. I'm not saying that like I need necessarily like a better position right now. I think that there's like other people far away from here that you never think about that are like being compartmentalized from your like idea of production that are suffering immensely.
Yo, I'm sending you a link to the Discord, Liar Judas, and we have a part called like the library that you can find a copy of it.
I have a copy right here. I'll put it in chat. We should put it in chat at the beginning of everything, just so that people have it. There's the PDF.
But also join the Discord if you want.
but also join the Discord. This is just something I brought up real quick. This is actually by the author of the book, Jason Hickel. I'm not going to really read through the whole thing because it's really just a summarization of everything that we've just read and been going over. It's not really like super necessary to go over this, but it's time for a global minimum wage. Capital has been globalized, but the rules protect people from capitalism have not. There's our guy, Jason Hickel. That is the likeness of the individual that we have.
It's such a great headshot.
But yeah, so he is making the radical claim that there should be instituted a global minimum wage. And this global minimum wage should be no less than 50% of the median wage of the nation and necessarily higher than the national poverty line would suggest that a wage needs to be. So let's talk about the implications of that, because there may be some very hairpin trigger responses to that suggestion, which is that you can't just raise wages. Okay. So as wages increase across the spectrum, the minimum wage would automatically move up. For countries where wages are so low that 50% of the median would still leave workers in poverty, there would be a second safeguard. Wages in each country would have to be above the national poverty line. So what you would see here, and this is what happens in this country, when you say that we need a $15 an hour minimum wage or anything like that, it's like, well, where's this money going? People are going to go broke. This is going to ruin everything. You can't just artificially like raise. This is against the free market. The market will suggest the wage, and why can't people work? Blah 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 blah. So here's a very interesting study that suggests that there is no evidence that raising minimum wages has any negative effect on employment. Indeed, a recent study found that doubling the wages of sweatshop workers in Mexico would raise the price of clothes sold in the U.S. How much? Double it. Here, Johnny, here. So if I were to double, let's go into like a crazy fantasy, like hypothetical right now. If there was a sweatshop in Mexico and I were to double, that's a 100% increase. Double the wages. How much do you think that would cause the end product sold in the United States to cost? How much would it increase?
I mean, the company would probably charge you like, you know, whatever it is, whatever widget it is that they're making, like Liar Judah said, like $200 easy. It'll go from like, you know, a $25 widget to like $200.
It would cost 1.8% more. It would raise the price 1.8%. And I have the study here. I'll pull it up just because I know it sounds crazy. Let me just finish reading this point there, which is too little for most consumers in rich countries to notice. In fact, you could raise sweatshop wages by a factor of 10 and consumers still wouldn't be phased. A study by the National Bureau of Economic Research shows that people are willing to pay up to 15% more on a $100 item and 28% more on a $10 item if it is made under good working conditions. So let's just bring this up real quick, because I know it sounds like I'm talking like some really like ridiculous stuff here. Okay.
All right. So, or let's say something is like $25.
Well, they gave you already an example for $10 and $100. But you can extrapolate that. So here's the Center for Economic and there we go.
Too enhanced.
Why does the minimum wage have no discernible effect on employment? By John Smith, February 2013. The employment effect of the minimum wage is one of the most studied topics in all of economics. This report examines the most recent wave of this research, roughly since the year 2000, to determine the best current estimates of the impact of increases in the minimum wage on the employment prospects of low-wage workers. The weight of that evidence points to little or no employment response to modest increases in the minimum wage. The report reviews evidence on 11 possible adjustments to minimum wage increases that may help to explain why the measured employment effects are so consistently small. The strongest evidence suggests that the most important channels of adjustment are reductions in labor turnover, improvements in organizational efficiency, reductions in wages of higher earners, wage compression, and small price increases. Given the relatively small cost to employers of modest increases in the minimum wage, these adjustment mechanisms appear to be more than sufficient to avoid employment losses, even for employers with a large share of low-wage workers. Obviously, I'm not going to go through this whole thing with you. I will go down to the conclusion.
Just tell me how much, $10 gets increased by.
I just told you 1.8%.
What is 1.8%?
Of $10?
Yeah.
$1.80.
So $10, is it something that costs $10 becomes like $11.80?
Oh, wait. No, $1.80, that would be out of 100. This would be 18 cents.
18 cents?
Yeah.
What?
Wait, no. I'm sorry. Am I tripping out here?
Bro, I'm not good at math. I'm like so fucking bad.
Yeah, 1.8. It's like I know math, but then when you put me on the spot, it's like 1.8% of 10 is 18 cents. It would go up 18 cents. That's what I said.
Wow. All right. So literally, if they just doubled their workers' wages, it would cost them on the other end to charge another 18 cents.
You scared me for a second. I was like, oh my God, am I being stupid?
No, I'm being stupid. I don't know math. Do you have any idea how long it took me? I have like an associate's degree in education. Do you have any idea how long it took me to pass like the remedial math class that you have to take?
Liar Judas. It also did it also discussed, if you heard what I read, it also did a 10 times increase, which if you did it by 10 times, in fact, you could raise sweatshop wages by a factor of 10 and consumers still wouldn't be phased. A study at the National Bureau of Economic Research shows that people are willing to pay up to 15% more on a $100 item. So that means you'd spend 115 and as a result to 100 if you knew that it was made under good working conditions. I guess there was some survey or poll done where they asked people like, would you be willing to spend like a little bit more? Then it came to, if you not only were they willing to do 15% more on a $100 item, but they would be willing to do up to 28% more on a $10 item.
I wonder how many people were like, no, I actually prefer my goods made by children.
Yeah. But so just to get back into this study before we slide off. So economists have conducted hundreds of studies of the employment impact of the minimum wage. Summarizing those studies is a daunting task, but 2 recent meta-studies analyzing the research conducted since the early 1990s conclude that minimum wage has little or no discernible effect on the employment prospects of low-wage workers. The most likely reason for this outcome is that the cost shock of the minimum wage is small relative to most firms' overall costs and only modest relative to the wages paid to the low-wage workers. In the traditional discussion of the minimum wage, economists have focused on how these costs affect employment outcomes, but employers have many other channels of adjustment. Employers can reduce hours, non-wage benefits, or training. Employers can also shift the composition toward higher skilled workers, cut pay to more highly paid workers, take action to increase worker productivity from reproduction to increasing training, increase price to consumers, or simply accept a small profit margin. Smaller. Workers may also respond to the higher wage by working harder on the job, but probably the most important channel of adjustment is through reductions in labor turnover, which yield significant cost savings to employers. Okay, here we go. One more part of this that I wanted. This is just about that. Where did it go? With all of these results, the crucial Oh, geez. Sorry.
I did say earlier that boxed wine is literally good. Like, I guess it's worse for the environment, but it's just good wine. Yeah, I feel like it's classist to judge people that drink Spaceman bag wine. Like, fuck it, bro.
I have it snipped here. I'm trying to find it in the study. It says, with all of these results, the crucial overall finding is straightforward, that the price markups needed to fully finance 100% wage increases for production level workers are well within the range of markups that, according to polling data, U.S. consumers say that they would be willing to pay to assure that non-sweatshop conditions prevail at the level of garment production.
Right.
I don't know why I'm having such a hard time finding that in the study. I literally clipped it out of there.
Can't slap the bag with no bag. Can't do the sweatshop labor without the sweatshops.
What the hell? I don't know, like, how I would have gotten this out of that. I don't know. Whatever.
Whatever. Yeah, trust us. Trust. Not us. Trust Patrick.
Yeah, I didn't make that quote up.
He totally didn't make it up.
I'll put the whole thing in here too, just so, like, if anybody else wants to look over that study.
Like, even regular consumers, presumably little class conscious, are like, yeah, I'd pay more for better conditions. Like,
Yeah.
yes. Is my Kirkland brand clothing gonna go up though?
What do you mean? The kids will eat? Oh, God.
I guess. But what are the kids gonna do with their free time if they're not making my sneakers?
Yeah. Well, they. What am I going to give them? Welfare? So the next is a concept which is interesting. Is the concept of universal basic income. You all right?
Yeah, no. I whenever I hear UBI brought up, I get flashbacks to the Andrew Yang campaign and arguing with people on the internet for like hours at a time about how like his idea of UBI is actually like fucking awful. Like for those of you that don't remember Andrew Yang, who like, you know, ran for I think president, like, you know, out of New York or whatever. What Andrew Yang's idea is that like, well, we'll just cut all programs, like all welfare programs. We'll just get rid of all of them, and then we'll just give everybody like $1,000 a month. Like, yeah, that was his idea.
In a much more, in my opinion, logical way of UBI, which is not something that was not done in socialist experiment countries, is that really what Jason Hickel is describing as universal basic income is what comes as resources being treated as commons. That you can't come into a country and just purchase up all the timber. You can't just purchase up the copper mine. You can't purchase the cobalt mines. You can't buy up all the farmland and simply extract extract profit from this. If these resources are treated as commons, and the entire nation will benefit, and a stipend will be paid out to yeah, exactly. And a stipend will be paid out to each individual citizen as a dividend of their stake in the land that they live on. Now, this may sound like a crazy, revolutionary, Fidel Castro style nationalization program that's going to require like the kulaks to be liquidated and all of the land to be expropriated. But actually, we just do it in the United States already. It's actually already literally happening in the United States to a pretty, and it's happening in the good grand state of Alaska. I don't know.
The like conservative, like fucking Arctic, like what do they call it? Like Siberian outpost of America, Alaska.
Yeah. So in Alaska, for those that don't know, there's the Alaska Permanent Fund. Is a constitutionally established permanent fund managed by a state-owned corporation, the Alaska Permanent Fund Corporation. It was established in Alaska in 1976 by Article 9, Section 15 of the Alaska State Constitution under Governor J. Hammond and Attorney General Avram Gross. From 1976 to 1980, the Department of Revenue, Treasury Division managed the state's permanent fund assets until in 1980, Alaska State Legislature created the ABFC. As of 2019, the fund was worth approximately $64 billion and has been funded by oil revenues and has paid out an average of approximately $1,600 annually per resident. The main use for the fund's revenue has been to pay out the permanent fund dividend, which many authors portray as the only example of basic income in practice. There's an area down here where it just goes over the impact of it, which is probably the most relevant. As 2018 found that the Alaska Permanent Fund dividend had no effect on employment and increased part-time work by 1.8 percentage points, meaning that it didn't cause a bunch of people to not work because they have some kind of universal basic income.
Right.
Our results suggest that a universal and permanent cash transfer does not significantly decrease aggregate employment. Then there's also this real weird thing down here where they say that in 2019 studies found that a 40% increase in substance abuse incidents the day after the payment is made and a 10% increase over the following 4 weeks. So like, I mean, I guess you can use that as a criticism of the payment.
There's going to be some kinks in the system, when it first rolled out. All right. There's going to be some growing pains. All right. Yeah. But like that
Alaskans might get really mad, might go get wasted. I mean, I guess you could say that we can curb it for that, but
I want to know like what the substance was specifically. Like
it's
either going to be like, it's probably like crystal meth, right?
But also, it does go on to say that this is partially offset by an 8% decrease in poverty crime with no changes in violent crimes on an annual basis.
Right, and isn't that like their big thing? Aren't they always harping on about like broken windows and shit? So like, isn't that like an overall good thing?
Yeah,
like people are gonna buy drugs. Maybe we need other programs.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, but you can't just hand someone $1,600 a year and be like, now I can do whatever I want. Now I owe you nothing.
This is the most important point in what I like. My biggest criticism of the way that Andrew Yang wanted to implement UBI is
that the Yang, right? That like if you just hand these people the money and then landlords are like, oh, I see that you're getting an extra $5,000.
Yes,
that's interesting.
Yes, it was not even $5,000. It's only like $1,000.
It could be anything. I'm saying any amount of money. Like, a landlord class could be like, oh, I see you get an extra $1,000 a month.
Right. So unless you're going
rent $700.
Right. So unless you're going to like freeze rent, or unless you're like rent prices, or you're going to have some kind of like price control on like how much rent can possibly be for X amount of square feet or whatever the fuck it is you want to do. Right, like that they'll obviously break all the fucking time, right? You're just gonna see this UBI, right, just get gobbled up by landlords, like they're or some other fucking means, or you'll see insurance companies or some other fucking field, like unless you have nationalized industry, right, around what the fuck is it called, like inelastic demands, right? like healthcare, like, insurance, like housing, like education and all this other shit, you're gonna see it get sucked up by that industry. That's my only criticism about UBI, is that like you literally cannot have it unless you have something that like is basically a socialist state.
Yeah, I agree. But I mean, really, just this term, universal basic income, Jason Hickel here is really just evoking the legacy of socialist countries as they have gone throughout the 20th century. He's not stating anything different. He's stating that, hey, if the people of Chile want their copper mine to enrich its own citizens, then they can. You know what I mean? Like that's really all. Like that's really all he's stating by a universal basic income. I mean, listen. If you read this to someone and said just replace the word Alaska with Venezuela, they would be like, "This is the most despicable policy I've ever heard in my life."
This is why it doesn't work, and not like why fucking like what are the poverty rates in Alaska?
I don't know. I'm actually curious. 10.5. That's kind of high, right? That's kind of high, right?
What's the national average of poverty in the U.S.? It's 12.8%.
Oh, so it's lower. I agree with this assessment here.
Its capitalist response to social ills, the most sensible way to do it is make sure life necessities are free to access. And then we can work out how luxuries are distributed. Yeah, well, I mean, like, that's another thing is that, like, people want to act as if, like, fucking... I still remember having an argument with my friend one time about, like, well, I think that, like, we should replace all private transportation under a socialist state with, like, good, sensible public transportation, all this other shit. He's like, but I like driving cars. And I'm like, well, it's not as if, like, people didn't have, like, boats and, like, cars and shit and all kinds of other things in like the Soviet Union or currently in China or like any other socialist fucking state you want to look at. It's not as if people don't have like luxury items.
So moving on from UBI, the next is land security, which has been a tenet of socialist projects throughout their history. Land reform, land expropriation, land equality. So in the book, Jason Hickel says, there is also the matter of the new alliance for food security and nutrition, which has spurred land grabs, the name of reducing hunger. We discussed this ad nauseum in our last stream. If you didn't see it, the way in which that these, NGOs or charitable institutions are seeking to get land to reduce hunger, they're actually like forcing many people off of their ancestral land and forcing them into wage labor and actually driving hunger up quite considerably. Operating under the assumption that corporations can produce food more efficiently, but by dispossessing small farmers, it paradoxically risks increasing hunger. The weight of evidence suggests that the best strategy for tackling hunger is in fact the opposite approach: land reform in favor of small farmers whose produce already feeds the vast majority of the world's population. Indeed, that's how China eradicated so much hunger during the 1990s. In 2014, the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food affirmed this point, calling for strong protections against agribusiness land grabs and laws that ensure small farmers have rights to use, save, and exchange seeds. Actually, something interesting that I came upon here. Where are you? I was actually trying to find that specific study, and I found this. I just thought this was pretty interesting, and I think you would like it, Johnny. So this is called this is called Framing Hunger: A Response to the State of Food Insecurity in the World in 2012. On March 12th, 2013, a group of U.S. and Canadian scholars and leaders of organizations addressing hunger submitted to the Director General Jose Graziano de Silva of the Food and Agriculture Organization, the United Nations, a document titled Communication for Discussion. In it, we raised critical concerns about the core message of the 2012 edition of the preeminent annual report on hunger worldwide, the agency's state of food insecurity in the world. makes some pretty interesting claims here. Sophie's portrayal of global progress fails to convey how concentrated and uneven the gains have been. It could also lead readers to conclude that a return to trends prior to the 2007 recession would largely meet hunger reduction goals. Sophie 12 reports a marked global advance since 1990 in reducing the prevalence of hunger until the recession began in 2007, when the prevalence of hunger did not increase, but its decline slowed. Sophie 12 fails, however, to make clear how concentrated that global gain has been. In fact, advancement in reducing hunger by just two countries, China and Vietnam, amounts to 91% of the net numerical reduction in undernourished people since between 1990 and 1992.
I wonder how they did that.
Of course, there were gains in other countries, largely offset by losses elsewhere, but readers should be aware that without the progress made in China and Vietnam, the world would have experienced almost no net gain.
Which, he's literally stated in prior chapters of this book. Liar Judas, yes, Jason Hickel provides a lot of citations in the book, which is also why I recommend checking out this book via PDF. It makes it a lot easier, because some of the stuff is literally just articles that you can Google right then and there, and some of them are also just literally websites that you can go to.
Is there a reason why you asked that if you didn't provide citations?
And some of the times the things that we bring up are actually the citations that he brings up.
Most of the things that I'm bringing up are the citations. To be fair with everybody, in the book that we're reviewing, I'll admit that I'm using the citations that are. Here's actually the book. This is the PDF that I just shared. This is the book. It's the book in its entirety, and at the bottom it actually provides hyperlinks here. I am looking up stuff to bolster what the book says, because I just don't like merely reading a paragraph out of a book and not providing something a little more tangible to be able to be this isn't some just the scribblings of some economically illiterate leftist who just did whatever, blah blah blah. It's this is very, very much validated through a number of reputable institutions, and not through some deeply esoteric or conspiratorial Marxist.org thing. It's very well above board institutions that are carrying out these studies that this is all there's a constant thing that's Marxists don't understand economics, and it's that's why I feel the need to provide ample evidence for the claims that we're making here.
And a lot of times if we're playing a YouTube video, it's just something that I found that I think is peripherally related, it's just something to watch, because this is a visual medium, and there's nothing more attraction or attractive or eye grabbing or whatever than just watching two dudes read a PDF for 3 hours.
So here, if you actually use this PDF that I put in the chat, if you look right here, there's the citation. It's actually a hyperlink that you can click, and it'll bring you to the glossary, to the exact part, and then it'll have the exact source. So, and some of them even have their own individual hyperlinks that you can click on, and it'll take you there. So it's actually very, very convenient, because I have obviously the hard copy of the book, which I did my reading out of, but when I'm kind of preparing my presentation for the stream, it's really easy to be able to just read it and then copy and paste it and click through those hyperlinks. Sorry.
It's all good, man.
Luckily for you, we have assembled a lot of the information into a easily consumable stream. We only stutter through a little bit.
Just a little. We only get stun locked a couple times.
So, now we've kind of gone through, obviously, the long historical and critical analysis of the systems of poverty. Now we've gone through a number of potential solutions, such as debt resistance, global democracy, fair trade, just wages, universal basic income. The next one is tax justice, which I don't think really needs a lot to substantiate it, because during our last stream, we really went into tax havens and illicit outflows and misinvoicing and all the way that big business does this tax fraud that defunds many, many billions of dollars from global South nations. Tax justice just essentially means we can't do that anymore. Enact laws, put everything above board, don't allow that to happen. The next comes in, and this is what I want to say to a lot of people that like, they say these things about these issues as they happen in the country. Whenever anybody asks for UBI or land reform or the improvement in wages or social programs, they always say things like people are looking for charity, people are looking for handouts, people are doing all these things. There's a great quote from this book that like slaps that argument down so hard and says, none of the people involved in this struggle are asking for charity, nor are they calling for more aid disbursements. They are taking matters into their own hands, building solidarities, challenging power interests, tackling root causes, in many cases, putting their lives on the line in the process. If we were to have a fair shot at a better world, it will be down to their hard work and courage. So this is actually the exact opposite of asking for a handout of aid. Right now, what they are receiving is aid. Aid is the problem. They're not asking for aid. They're asking for self-determination.
Right. Because again, as if like, you know, the last, what are we at, 213 pages, as if like the last 200 pages haven't been a strong evidence-based sources cited argument that aid, right, does nothing but undercut, right, these policies, this what is it, like independent way out of poverty, out of hunger, out of you know, basically being taken advantage of and being exploited, right, by these countries that, like, you know, he said in other chapters that need the global South more than the global South needs the North. Mm-hmm. You know, from day one, literally. But I think like if we're
Britain was a underdeveloped backwater in India and China, where 75 accounted for like 75% of the global economy.
Right. I'll never forget. I forget which episode it was we were doing where you read off the quote that the Chinese emperor said to, you know, the English trader, like,
that was like the first ones.
Quit bringing these rags, all right? Like, we got silk.
He was like, yeah, that was funny.
Yeah, he's like, I know you come from like a primitive, you know, still developing society, but next time, just bring the gold and the silver, all right?
Our kingdom provides everything that we need at higher quality than anything that you bring us. Like, they were like, we'll set up a trade deal with you for y'all because y'all need it. We don't really need any of that bullshit.
What is this jellied eel shit? Get the fuck out of here.
I think he actually said jellied eel specifically.
Do they really bring jellied eels to China? I mean, I feel like, yeah, they probably have eels. Like, they probably have some form of jellied eel in China.
So then there is, you know, remember kind of what you were saying before. Hey, Dorian, what's up? Taking back what was saying you asking for a handout. Yeah, absolutely. And also, it's like the absolute opposite of asking for a handout. Handouts is what they're currently receiving. This entire book is against stop giving handouts. We don't want handouts. We just want our own self-determination. Sorry.
Right. You know, do you want to get to the part where he starts talking about what the hell is it, like indigenous groups and stuff like that? Or
I didn't even really get to that part.
Are we still on Reclaiming the Commons?
I don't think that was in my book.
Dude. Get the fuck out of here. Are you serious?
Yeah, I saw that in the PDF, but I don't think mine has one called Reclaiming. Yeah, no, mine just ends at universal basic income and then tax justice and then land security and then it stops.
Oh shit, you didn't even have just wages or the Reclaiming the Commons?
That was all before that. But the Reclaiming the Commons isn't in my book. Maybe mine's an older. I know mine looks different than yours.
Yeah. All right. So there's like a lot here when he goes into, you know, there is in fact a cat. Look at that boy. Look at that goodest boy.
He'll meow at the door if I don't let him in.
All right. So tax evasion, land grabbing, and climate change, all of which have to do with reclaiming public resources and protecting the commons, right? And he goes on to talk about like fixing the international tax system. in strengthening domestic resource mobilization, including through international support to developing countries to improve domestic capacity for tax and other revenue collection. Right, the individuals and multinational corporations that offshore their income, the bankers who assist them, and the rich country governments and international institutions that make it all possible are let off the hook. Change the WTO's customs invoicing standards, which we talked about in previous chapters, which presently make it very easy for companies to steal money through trade misinvoicing and transfer mispricing, which I believe we went over on our last episode. Allowing customs officials to hold up transactions whose prices diverge suspiciously from standardized norms. Close down the secrecy jurisdictions that serve as tax havens in the first place. So that means Foxconn, gone. Fucking require multinational companies to report their profits in the countries where their economic activity actually takes place, rather than the current practice of providing a single consolidated balance sheet for all operations and filling it in as a separate low-tax jurisdiction. This is known as country-by-country reporting. Taxing multinationals as single firms rather than a collection of independent subsidiaries, and a global minimum tax on corporations, right? And then he goes on to talk about placing a moratorium on all deals that involve major transfers of land from small farmers, collective use, or ecosystem services to commercial use until such deals can be conducted transparently and with full involvement of affected communities. And I think that we have more than enough examples, right, for everybody in chat when we bring up stuff like indigenous sovereignty here in the US and in Canada, all the various pipelines that indigenous communities, not just because of out of respect for the land, and whatever religious tradition that gives it that importance, but also just the fact that a lot of times these are the water aquifers, right, for the land that they live on, and not even just for the land that they live on, but also for people that live outside of their jurisdiction, regular
in Palestine. This is specifically what's happening in Palestine.
Right, and we talked about that before, where they'll give them some shitty fucking well, and then because the Israeli government actually owns the land that the well is on, they will literally divert all the water away from that well, right, to prevent them from being able to get water out of it. And if they try and dig deeper with that well, or make a new one, an Israeli bulldozer will be there the next day to tear it down, and I assume IDF will be.
And then they sell their own water back to them.
Right. Out of a Nestle fucking plastic bottle, right? It's destruction to use a resource we actively should not be using, and in fact do not fucking need to. Yeah. So he goes on to talk about the best strategy for tackling hunger is in fact the opposite approach. Land reform in favor of small farmers whose produce already feeds vast majority of the world's population. And I think that
what he said, this is what China did in the 1990s, right?
Right. This is what Cuba has done since the 1990s. They were heavily reliant on a lot of I think, what was that?
Soviet aid.
Yeah, a lot of Soviet aid, predominantly for. Yeah, you can sub. They were reliant on a lot of aid from the Soviet Union, and stuff like that. And then when it was forcibly dissolved, they lost a lot of that food aid. The very thing that Thomas Sankara was trying to prevent, and why he was no, keep your food. You can give us seeds, or you can give us plows. You can give us you can give us tractors. Fertilizer, stuff like that. Other than that, so we don't need no
controls you.
Yeah.
And also, wait, do you have a lot more to go through on this chapter?
Not a whole lot more, but there's one part that's super duper that I've highlighted in red that I really want to get to. Because he starts talking about.
I was going to jump to the Thomas Sankara quote that starts the next chapter because you were. So I don't want to do that if you have more. So go ahead.
There's not that much left. So he talks about carbon colonialism. Right now, so that's something other than this, what did he call it before? Sub-imperialism.
Mm-hmm.
like, submissive imperialism, reevaluate all such transactions to ensure that they don't force people off their land in the name of climate change mitigation, something that we were talking about in the last chapter, right? And this is the most important part, because indigenous people who inhabit forests are particularly vulnerable to dispossession under carbon trading schemes. Special care needs to be taken to ensure that their rights to the land and forest resources are respected, and this should not have to require granting them formal title deeds, which often paradoxically renders people even more vulnerable to dispossession, right? Because as we've seen, especially here in the U.S. historically, right, there were nations that had deeds, and people of that nation had deeds to the land that were rat fucked on every fucking direction of the wind, to get their title, their deed to the land, right? Rich countries will have to hit zero carbon emissions by 2035, and poor countries will have to follow suit by 2050. If the top 10% of individuals with the biggest carbon footprints reduce their emissions down to the level of even just the average European, rich countries could cut their emissions by 33%, and this could theoretically be achieved in a single year. The Paris Agreement makes no reference to fossil fuels or fossil fuel companies, and they should end subsidies for fossil fuel companies, which presently amount to $5.3 trillion per year. Thank you, Sam, for gifting Dorian the sub.
Yeah, I didn't want to cut you off, but I was like, is there subs happening? Because
there's subs. We got subs.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. We're trying to, at some point, we might switch from StreamYard to Streamlabs so that we can have more of like a theatrical notification system when things happen. Because right now we have nothing other than like some like other Twitch stream to let us know. So thank you so much for any kind of support.
Yeah, I promise 2023 is going to be like a big year. I feel like we're going for like 3 hours or I can stop.
I wish I could go for another 3 hours. I mean, maybe if Johnny wants to hang out, but unfortunately I have a couple more school assignments that I have to get submitted by midnight, and I also have work in the morning, and I need to eat before in some point through that. Sorry, I just have a lot on my plate these days.
Don't worry about it, dude.
We will be expanding though. That's the plan.
All right, so Liar, like we probably won't be streaming in another 3 hours, but I promise you that we will be streaming. What is this? The 4th now. We will be streaming on Wednesday the 7th. All right. So
and also, just before I get too off topic, I didn't want to break your train, but thank you so much. I read this and I appreciate it. The vibe sounds really cool. I'm glad I remind you of an old friend. I didn't want to just ignore that. But yeah, we'll be back, Liar, just for reference. Right now, as of right now, we're doing every Saturday. Wow.
Sunday and
Wednesday evening. And it is a kind of like an interactive podcast / book club where we read sections of the book and then we go over certain parts of the book. We were just finishing The Divide by Jason Hickel. And I guess this is as good a time as ever to announce this. We're reading The Counter-Revolution of 1776 by Gerald Horne. So if you tune in on Wednesday night, we'll be going over the first chapter or two of that book. And as the days go on, we will be going through that book and bringing up studies, examples, discussions, historical implications, all of those things to that. If you want to read along with us, great. If you want to take this as a analysis of the book so that you can learn about the subjects, that's great too. That's the whole reason we're doing it. So that you can either read along with us or just glean the information from our summarization and report.
Yeah, and we don't fuck around. We stay on schedule. All right. You saw me eat like that weird sandwich thing I made before. All right.
Also, we are intending on adding a third day of streaming on Friday nights that will break the more structured book report type of book club aspect and have more of just like a chill stream where we maybe go over current event. Dude, it's so funny that I was like, yeah, I don't know, we could talk about Kanye West, and then like the very next day he goes on Alex Jones.
He goes on Alex Jones.
I was like, oh my god. But yeah, so not just so that we can conclude here, because I don't want to have to run off on everybody before we actually finish the contents of the book. We've talked about Thomas Sankara. We have evoked the legacy of our spiritual advisor, Thomas Sankara, innumerably as we went through this book, because you cannot talk about global poverty. You cannot talk about debt retaliation. You cannot talk about toxic aid disbursements without talking about the visionary Thomas Sankara. And in this very book, the last chapter begins with a quote from Comrade Sankara himself. And it states,
Yo, same.
What?
Liar Judas said, I credit learning about Sankara early on for my current MLism. Yeah. I mean, like, look, watching that documentary on YouTube, Thomas Sankara, The Upright Man. Yeah, that'll change your life.
This is what he says. He says, you cannot carry out fundamental change without a certain amount of madness. In this case, it comes from nonconformity, the courage to turn your back on the old formulas, the courage to invent the future.
Which is literally what my friend reads at the beginning of their podcast, Inventing Reality. Yeah. It's you remember Pulls of the Round Table?
Yeah.
Yeah, when they started a new podcast called Inventing Reality, like, you know, my friend like read off that quote, and like, you know, it's sick. It's awesome.
So then it goes into a chapter called The Conundrum of Growth. And I feel like there's some really great content here that I want to highlight. And this is about GDP and what GDP as a metric. This is probably one of the most common measurements that you will hear in terms of economics or rating the viability or success of a country. Is if line go up, then good. If line go down, then bad. This is some information that will kind of show how simplistic and useless GDP actually is. So GDP was intended to be a wartime measure. This is when GDP was initially constructed, was during the Great War. I guess, was it World War II or World War I?
World War II.
World War II, okay. Which is why it is so single-minded, almost even violent. It tallies up all money-based activities, but it doesn't care whether that activity is useful or destructive. If you cut down a forest and sell the timber, GDP goes up. If you strip a mountain range to mine for coal, GDP goes down. If you extend the working day and push back the retirement age, GDP goes up. But GDP includes no cost accounting. It does not measure the cost of losing the forest as a sinkhole for carbon dioxide, or the loss of the mountain range as a home for endangered species, or the toll that too much work takes on people's bodies and minds and relationships. And not only does it leave out what is bad, but it also leaves out much of what is good, for it does not count useful activities that are not monetized. If you grow your own food, clean your own house, or take care of your aging parents, GDP says nothing. For these activities don't involve transacting money. It only counts if you buy these services. And as David Attenborough once so eloquently put it, anyone who thinks that you can have infinite growth on a finite planet is either a madman or an economist. Did you have anything you wanted to interject with here?
Oh, yeah. No, I have a couple videos that I put in chat. There's one that goes over, like, what is GDP and why is it bad for us?
Okay, let's start with that.
Line goes up. If line go down, we have to sacrifice grandma. That was, out of all the memes from COVID that stuck with me, I think that's a big one. We have to sacrifice your grandma for the economy.
Rate how well you think you're doing in life. What criteria would you use? How happy you are in life? How happy you can help others be? How many friends you have? Maybe how fit or good looking you think you are? Or how much money you earn? The dominant criterion that policymakers use to measure country performance is GDP, or gross domestic product.
GDP, economic growth, productivity,
economic growth, gross domestic product.
GDP measures the market value of all the goods and services that are bought in an economy for a given year. It doesn't matter whether those goods and services come from things that damage your health, that damage the environment, or even sometimes whether those things are even legal. We value what we measure, and currently what we're measuring according to GDP is leading us astray. David Pulling, author of The Growth Delusion, has this example.
Breast milk values nothing, and yet powdered milk, which we know in certain circumstances can be quite damaging, especially in the developing world if it's mixed with bad water. But that has an economic value. Now, does that set these invisible economic incentives? It's quite hard to prove.
What's
But
up,
intuitively,
horse?
You might think, yes, it does.
So what are the origins of
You had a
GDP?
horse emote. I would say
GDP
put the
was
horses in
developed
chat.
in the US and the UK as a response to the Great Depression in the 1930s, as a way to keep track of what the country was producing. Even from the beginning, one of the key creators of GDP, Simon Kuznets, argued that it wasn't a particularly good measure of social progress or even economic welfare. Kennedy actually once put it.
It measures everything in short, except that which makes life worthwhile.
It measures economic value no matter how it's distributed in the economy. Over the previous decade or so, we've seen more and more of that value going towards the very top of the income distribution, so that those in the rest of the income distribution don't see those benefits. But that isn't reflected in measures of GDP growth.
Pat's going to be right there with you,
Reduced
horse, in about an hour.
No matter whether it's good or bad for society. And what about the things that are valuable to us, but that aren't bought and sold in the market? Take, for example, a teacher and a financial trader. According to the market, the teacher is valued much lower in terms of the teacher's salary than the financial trader. But in terms of actual social value creation, what the teacher is doing has so much more social value in terms of students that will go on to earn livings and to help other people, compared to the financial trader who is redistributing value between himself and other traders.
You got
Now
this, horse.
particularly in
I
advanced
believe in you.
economies, in very much in a service economy, a sort of normal measure of national accounting of judging how well our
What's the
economy is
topic,
doing
horse?
is very poor at grasping quality, which is really the essence of services. You know, GDP is terrible at haircuts and it's terrible at landscape gardening. It's very good at steel and bricks. When you move into the internet age, as you move from analog to digital, GDP kind of almost collapses because, you know, you have things that were part of the economy, things like booking a flight that you used to pay somebody for. They used to have a job that was registered as GDP. Now you do it yourself. And so something that used to be part of the economy is now out of the economy.
The good news is there is a community of people developing alternative measures in an attempt to address the shortcomings of GDP. Probably the first such measure that was proposed was the United Nations Development Programme's Human Development Index. This looks not just at monetary incomes, but also looks at the health of a society and at the education of society. Another measure
Human
which has been proposed
Development
is the
Index.
General
Shout out,
Progress
Carola.
Indicator. It nets out social ills like crime and environmental damage and incorporates things like volunteering or household production. Another direction that social progress measures have gone is in terms of subjective well-being or life satisfaction. So directly asking people, how satisfied are you with life? What needs to happen is for politicians and policymakers to take these seriously and to invest their energies into developing a framework where these other measures can flourish.
Horse, I believe in you. I know that like you got a lot on your plate right now. You know, if I knew anything about statistics, you know, or I think that's what that is. Study FIR Statters tomorrow. Yeah, if I knew anything about statistics, I'd legitimately give you a hand, but I don't know dick about any of that. So yeah, there's also
so much respect to you for that, because I'm currently in school and I wrote like 1,000 words this weekend and I'm like, oh my god, like this, I've been working so hard to write these 2 essays and I couldn't even imagine doing like 8,000. So all respect to you and best of luck, and you can kill it. Okay.
you're gonna do great. I got faith in you. What the hell is it? So there's, along with GDP, there's also the other one, GPI, right?
Right before we get to that, I just want to, so we assume that when GDP goes up, it makes our lives better. It raises our incomes. It creates more jobs. It means better schools and hospitals and so on. This may have been true in the past when the world was relatively empty of people and the human footprint was small relative to the bounty of the earth. Unfortunately, it no longer holds. In the United States, GDP has risen steadily over the past half century, yet median incomes have stagnated. The poverty rate has increased and inequality has grown. The same is true on a global scale. While global real GDP has nearly tripled since 1980, the number of people living in poverty below $5 per day has increased by more than 1.1 billion. Why is this? Because past a certain point, GDP growth begins to produce more negative outcomes than positive ones, more ilth than wealth. I don't know if that's a real word, if it's just like a word play, ilth instead of wealth. The reason is because there are no longer any frontiers where accumulation doesn't directly harm someone else by, say, enclosing the land, degrading the soil, polluting the water, exploiting the humans, or changing the climate. We have reached the point where GDP growth is beginning to create more poverty than it eliminates. And I do have some graphs. I know how much we all appreciate graphs here.
Ilth is not a word. Tilth is.
ILL. This is how it's spelled. Ilth, as opposed to wealth.
No, it's not a fucking word. He's driving me insane. That's what he's trying to do. He's trying to drive me crazy by adding these fucking like weird like word conventions.
He did put it in quotations. To be fair, he put it in quotations.
No, he's trying to gaslight me. That's what he's doing. All right, it's bad enough his name is so close to Jason Hickel, right? He's doing it on purpose. All right.
So while we already identified that GDP is very poor in its indication of overall benefit or overall standard for a country, it leaves out many factors. Also, we can say that it doesn't even adequately account for what it is intended to do, which is money and wealth specifically, even if it is at the detriment of other things. So even in the one thing that it does claim to show a valuable metric of, which is income, here is personal income lagging behind growth, median individual income, blue line, and GDP per capita going up, but this line stay the same. I know this is very, very confusing for our line enthusiasts out there, that how can line go up but stay the same? But radically, that is happening.
Get the fuck out of here. Where'd you fucking find that? Google did not pull shit for me.
Sam, if you just made that up, I'm very impressed.
I swear to God, if you made this up, Sam. Did you make it up? I could not find it.
Yeah, it sounds like a legit. I think he did. I think they did.
Chat is fucking gaslighting me right now. No. I literally Googled it. It didn't come up. You're lying.
Also, yeah, you know, time's like an illusion, you know?
It's like a flat circle.
Time's a flat circle.
I Googled it like in real time. It didn't come up. I even like put the quotation marks around ilth.
Pull up the link.
I did
it. And also, they were quick to the draw with the fake hyperlink too. Like they putting that on there real quick.
It's not even a fake hyperlink. It's real. I fucking hate this shit. This is bullshit.
Wait. Whoa. Man, you look like a fool right now. Not me, though.
Whatever. Go back to your fucking lines.
Okay, back to the graphs.
Back to the lines.
The economy grows, but households work more. Here is blue line for average annual hours worked, and then GDP chained in 2005 dollars, surpassing it. Economy doubled, but pension coverage shrank. So here's GDP line go up, and here's pension coverage just dismally plummeting. Here's
my dad can attest to that.
Bankruptcy. Here's how GDP up, and then as of after 2005, just a steadily declining household and nonprofit debt. A growing economy but no progress on poverty. This is very, very specific to what we were discussing. Here's GDP go up, and here is poverty fluctuate, go a little bit up, but also stay relatively will stay well above the GDP line.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is like that graph that became really popular when somebody put anime faces like on the two little points of like, productivity and wages just going down in opposite directions.
Here is GDP and childhood poverty, which is in no way correlative. Here is growth not so having social ills, index of social health score. I really don't know how long this is going to go for, so you might want to buckle up. Maximum security growth. This is the incarcerated population per 1,000 with the GDP. Some things grow faster in the economy. While GDP doubled, the incarceration rate tripled.
Yeah, that's the industry that, not industry, but like that's the population that I work with. I swear to God, I'm not pulling a Rick Ross. I don't work for a prison or anything like that, but I do work with people.
Dude, are you a secret CEO and rapping under the pseudonym that you stole from a real person? Dialectically, the famous cocaine kingpin that was involved in Iran-Contra, Johnny Dialectically.
Hey, well, how else do you think that I afforded all this fancy computer gear? I've been pushing weight, man. I got that fish scale. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Rick Ross did that. There's like a real guy named Freeway Ricky Ross.
Yeah.
From Compton. Crazy story. The dude was illiterate until he went to prison, and he was but he was really good at tennis. Like apparently he played tennis alongside Venus and Serena Williams. Like he was so good at tennis that they kind of just shuffled him through school without knowing how to read.
Get the fuck out of here.
Yeah, he became one of the biggest drug dealers in American history, then went to jail for like 25 years and somehow taught himself to read, studied in the law library, and then got himself out of prison. I think he owns like weed businesses now or something like that.
Isn't that the guy that like pushed crack for the FBI?
Yeah. He was involved in Iran-Contra.
Yeah.
Yeah, Rick Ross. The real Rick Ross, not the rapper. And then the rapper the rapper
is like literally he was a corrections officer
in Miami. He was a corrections officer.
What a fucking piece of shit.
Yep.
And he tries to act like a gangster.
Yep. Growing economy and growing inequality. Economy may be growing, but the benefits are growing to fewer people. Outgrowing the earth. Ecological footprint. GDP in billions.
Well, I mean, wait. There's an interesting point in the book where he brings that up. Where the fuck is it? Here, if ancient Egypt had started with 1 cubic meter of possessions and grew them by 4.5% per year by the end of its 3,000-year civilization, which, by the way, ancient Egypt was a 3,000-year-long civilization, it would have needed 2.5 billion solar systems to store all of its stuff. Exponential growth is absolutely absurd.
Man, you can take my word for it. I think that the point has been demonstrated that GDP does not mean good. GDP line does not equal good. So,
no.
If anybody wants access to these many, many graphs, link in the chat.
And as much as like, look, you and me both know this. Like when we met, we would like bonded over Crocodile Hunter and shit. So like, I love fucking like nature documentaries and shit. And David Attenborough is like one of those like voices I hear in my head. You know what I mean? But when he like, I think like a year or two ago said some shit about how like, basically like poor people need to make less children. They're taking up all of the that was some like real fucking like.
The only thing I'll say about that is that it's an understandable misconception that is purported, that I felt like your own, like it's something that like makes sense in the most ignorant way, where you're like, yeah, more people, more stuff, yeah, and like you kind of have to do like at least like you have to do like 10 minutes more reading into it to understand why that isn't true, and it's pushed by a lot of that concept is pushed by a lot of people, and it makes a lot of sense at face value. But like if you put like 10 minutes worth of concentration on the issue, if you actually care to learn about it, you learn about how ridiculous that notion is.
Yeah, sadly, Liar Judas, no, I don't believe David Attenborough is a comrade. Maybe his brother was. Who knows? Maybe the wrong kid died. Doesn't make any sense at all if you like people. Seeing how much food gets there. Yeah, well, I mean, we've talked about this.
This was in the book. There's enough food not only to feed our entire population, but several billions more. We are not at the point of like resource scarcity in terms of non-artificial resource scarcity. There is artificial resource scarcity because we have an economic mode of production that only allocates resources to individuals that can pay for it. And if you cannot, then like you said, they will throw it directly in the trash and they will pour bleach on it while it's in the trash to stop you from eating it out of the dumpster.
Right. Or even worse, they will literally destroy the surplus product in order to ensure that scarcity. So they'll produce it and then destroy it without it ever actually going to market, right? To make sure that, like, you know, eggs or milk or potatoes or bread, like, stay at a consistent price. Because, like, honestly, right now, most of, like, the staple foods that we eat could probably be, like, sold for, like, effectively a fraction of the price that it currently is.
And I'm not going to harp on any kind of like a vegan thing, but like we can probably offer some kind of like large criticism towards factory farming and the way that it wastefully feeds food to food in a sense. Like you have to grow a ton of crops to feed it to a cow, which you then eat. You feed the cow way more crops than any person will eat to fatten up a cow, whereas all of that land could be used to grow other types of food that could be directly fed to humans. So I'm not going to turn this into a whole like you know, vegan thing or anything like that, but you can definitely look at the factory farm industry and a lot of wasteful food practices and water practices.
Well, you know, Pat can go full Earth Crisis on a later stream. Earlier in
the firestorm is coming.
Scientists tell us that even at existing levels of aggregate global consumption, we are already overshooting our planet's ecological capacity by about 60% each year, right? So, like, what he's saying is, right, you know, especially if you take into account what he said in the earlier chapter, right, that it's our method of distribution. And then there's exception as indigenous folks, you know. All right. Yes. There was more from that previous chapter that, like, you know, I was going to get at, but, like, you know, we're trying to also just, like, make good on time. But, like, please read this book.
Read the goddamn book.
And even follow Jason Hickel on Twitter, because he's even brought up how, like, you know, indigenous groups like the Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of Our America, better known as ALBA, right? They're doing a lot of good work. He mentions the Indigenous Environmental Network, which is, like, you know, an NGO, but, like, it seems kind of based. There's a lot of, you know, indigenous groups that a lot of people aren't even really that aware of. And I think that, like, until we see, like, a real what's the word? Like, you know, a what is this? I keep getting banned because my hatred for fans.
I don't even have a Twitter, so
I run the Twitter for the Twitch, and I also have my own private Twitter, which is honestly like the same thing. But what the fuck is it? You'll notice by who I follow on the Twitter that's linked to this account.
Let's calm down with all that.
What the hell is it? What the fuck is it? I think until we see, like, you know, a real unified and like real unified, like, taking hints at, like, what First Nations, right, are trying to achieve with, like, you know, these very marginally smaller socialist organizations within the US, until we start seeing, like, you know, real lockstep with that, I think we're going to continue to see, like, a lot of not malfunction, but just, like, more can be done. But that's a whole different topic for another stream. I think that maybe when we get to, like, you know, George Manuel's The Fourth World, or, like, you know, Redskin White Mass by Glenn Coulthard, you know, we can get a lot, you know, more into that. But yeah,
big things coming.
Also, being white, a white trader is extremely funny.
Race Trader, great band.
Yes, Race Trader is a great. I've seen them live. They were fucking cool, dude.
I saw them live once too.
Yeah.
All right. So, are you ready to get into the next section, or did you have more you wanted to get on into?
Where the fuck are we? We're at the end of the growth, the conundrum of growth, right?
Kind of. Where I was about to pick it up is in the chapter Inventing the Future. This is where it gets into the GPI, because we just went through the GDP stuff.
Bro, our copies are so different.
Well, I had like false promises and degrowth imperative, but they didn't really. There wasn't a ton in there that I felt like a lot of that was kind of covered incidentally.
Right. The degrowth imperative. Yeah, I guess they're
called How Degrowth Will Save the World. He has another entire book called How Degrowth Will Save the World. I don't have it, but it's on my list.
Right. And degrowth, there's a lot about that. We honestly could probably talk for like 2.5 hours about like degrowth.
That's why I didn't get right into that.
Yeah, so maybe like, if you guys want, like, please join the Discord. And like, I'll post the like YouTube playlist, of videos that I made that were like kind of complimentary to a lot of the stuff that like we did cover and some of the stuff that we didn't cover. So, join the Discord and check it out.
Right.
And so, the super bugs thing that, or whatever the fuck it is, 80% of cattle as well. Oh, I thought you were going to talk about eating bugs. All right, never mind. Keep going, Pat.
There's a place in Philadelphia that sells bugs in Reading Terminal. I saw it the other day.
It's Philadelphia. I believe that.
The next now, which is a paraphrased from Thomas Sankar's speech that we read earlier. The next section is called Inventing the Future. And this is where we start to talk about different ways that we might be able to measure countries in the world other than GDP. So if scientists are correct in saying that our model of exponential GDP growth lies at the very core of our crisis, then that's where we need to start when it comes to imagining an alternative future. One crucial first step would be to get rid of GDP as a measure of economic progress and well-being and replace it with something different. There are many alternative measures of success on offer. The genuine progress indicator, GPI, for example, starts with GDP, but then adds positive factors such as household and volunteer work, subtracts negatives such as pollution, resource depletion, and crime, and adjusts it just for inequality. A number of U.S. states like Maryland and Vermont have already begun to use GPI as a measure of progress, albeit secondary to GDP. Costa Rica is about to become the first country to do so, and Scotland and Sweden may soon follow. Here's
I just posted a video about the difference between GDP and GPI.
Okay, yeah, we'll just do that. Forget the Wikipedia article. It's probably cooler just to watch. No, I'm being serious. But I am going to have to go soon, just to make it aware. 8:30 is usually my tap out time, but
I know.
Over here. Don't look at my Diablo videos.
For a citizen dealing with the realities of daily life, gross domestic product can be a misleading figure. That's why the Genuine Progress Indicator was created. Both GDP and GPI use the same personal consumption data, but GPI allows for variables that apply monetary values to non-monetary aspects of the economy. For example, GPI is adjusted upward when a greater percentage of the nation's income goes to the poor, because an income increase provides a tangible benefit to the poor. GPI factors in the value of labor that goes into housework and volunteering. GPI treats money spent on durable goods, such as appliances and furniture, as a cost, and the value it provides as a benefit. Goods that perish quickly are viewed negatively, while GDP views all expenditures as positive news. GPI views infrastructure spending as a positive if it provides a long-lasting benefit. If it drains the government's coffers, it's a negative. GPI uses economic statistics and math formulas to place a value on many variables. Their value is then added or deducted from GDP. For example, the money foreigners invest in the US is subtracted from what Americans invest overseas. And a 5-year rolling average determines if the US is a lender or borrower. If the number indicates lender, the number is added to GDP. Since capitalist economies focus on making money, GPI has yet to become widely adopted.
You're muted, bro.
Sorry. Hey.
Also, when they brought up like the infrastructure and like, you know, the Fed and all that shit, here's this video by One Dime for chat to check out, you know, in their own time independently, about why like your taxes, your federal taxes at least, don't fund anything. So just check that out.
All right. So continuing. But even debt cancellation would only provide a short-term fix. It wouldn't really address the root problem, which is the fact that global economic system runs on money rather than debt. It's on money that is itself debt. This is probably some stuff that you've heard, right? Like every person that thinks that they're like a woke, like economy conspiracy theorist, where they're like, did you know that only 10% of the money is like real that are in banks? You've heard this before, right?
Yeah.
So when you walk into a bank and take out a loan, you assume that the bank is lending you money it has in its reserve. Real money that it stores in a basement vault, for example, collected from other people's deposits. But that's not how it works. Banks are only required to hold reserves worth about 10% of the money they lend out. This is known as fractional reserve banking. I'm sure you've heard the term. In other words, banks lend out about 10 times more money than they actually have. So where does the extra money come from if it doesn't actually exist? The banks create it out of thin air. They loan it into existence. About 90% of the money that is presently circulating in our economy is created in this manner. In other words, almost every single dollar that passes through your hands represents somebody's debt. And every dollar of debt has to be paid back with interest, with more work, more production, or more extraction. The fact that our economy runs on debt-based currency is one big reason that it needs constant growth. Restricting the fractional reserve banking system would go a long way to diminishing the amount of debt sloshing around in our economies and therefore to diminishing the pressure for growth. One easy way to do this would be to require banks to keep a bigger fraction of reserves behind the loans they make. But there's an even more interesting approach we might try. We could abolish debt-based currency altogether. Instead of letting commercial banks create our money, we could have the state create it free of debt and then spend it into the economy instead of lending it into the economy. The responsibility for money creation will be placed with an independent agency that is democratic, accountable, and transparent, and banks would still be able to lend money, of course, but they would have to back it with 100% reserves dollar for dollar.
Yeah, no, we are. I just posted a little short 1-minute YouTube video directly into the chat about like fractional reserve banking and stuff like that. But like, this is totally untenable. Like we're doomed. And like one of the big things that he talks about is like the imperative for corporations to maximize shareholder returns, right? And because we're a Twitch channel called Subversive History, and we go over the history of events, and all things, right, have a site of social construction or historical construction, right? Where does this imperative to maximize shareholder returns come from, right? And we can trace it back to 1919 with the landmark U.S. Supreme Court case, Dodge versus Ford Motor Company. At the time, the Ford Motor Company had a sizable capital surplus, and Henry Ford had decided to devote some of it to raising his workers' wages. Out of all the horrible things, this is probably like one of the few W's that, like, you know, I'll give him, which were already considered to be quite high. The Dodge brothers, two of the company's biggest shareholders, sued Ford for this move, claiming that Ford's capital actually belonged to the shareholders and that unnecessarily raising wages was effectively stealing from them. And the court ruled in their favor, the Dodge brothers, and a precedent was set. Like, so once again, the reason why we live in hell is because the Supreme Court is actually not designed to like assist, help, or grant freedoms in any like meaningful way. If CEOs want to spend money to increase wages or protect the environment in a manner that results in decreased shareholder returns, they can't, for it is effectively illegal to do so. Yeah, and if you really want to see like how fucking horrible Ford is, watch the movie Ford versus Man if you can find it on YouTube.
Oh wow. Okay. So, just to further expand on this, a first step in tackling this issue would be to take a serious look at the advertising industry, which is a major driver of unnecessary consumption. This hasn't always been the problem. As late as the early 20th century, consumption was a more or less perfunctory act. You basically bought what you needed. Advertisements did a little more than inform you of the useful qualities of an object. But retail companies realized that they couldn't expand indefinitely if everybody was buying only what was necessary. Limited needs mean limited profits. Companies needed a fix for this obstacle, a way to surmount the limit of market saturation, and they found it in the new theories of advertising being developed at the time by Edward Bernays. Bernays, the nephew of psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud, taught retailers that they could get people to buy things if they didn't need by manipulating their emotions. For example, you could seed anxiety in people's minds and then present your product as a solution to that anxiety, or you could sell things on the promise that they would provide social acceptance or class distinction. This is if you're familiar with sociology, this is like conspicuous consumption, if you ever heard of that term, consuming to show your wealth and your affluence and things like that and your place in society. This kind of advertising quickly became indispensable to American retailers desperate to keep demand perpetually high.
Okay.
It looks like you want to say something.
Edward L. Bernays, right? You know how like people talk about like all the time, like, oh, I could fix the world if I could go back in time and like kill baby Hitler or some shit like that. Okay. Yeah. Edward L. Bernays is like literally, I think like you could probably put more global harm on him than like the entire Third Reich. Wait, this sounds fucked up. Like, literally, like, no, that's maybe an overstatement. All right.
Yeah. There you go.
Edward L. Bernays. Let me reel it back a little. Edward L. Bernays is like the devil incarnate. And like, have you ever seen the documentary Ways of Seeing or whatever the fuck it's called?
I don't believe so.
Oh my god. Oh. All right.
Want to have a watch party?
We should. It's like 4 parts and it's like an hour long each time. But like Edward L. Bernays is like, you live in his world. He lived for like 108 fucking years, but like you basically like live in his world that he created. And like literally the reason why like marketing is the way it is, the reason why we're all addicted to like social media, right? Like all this shit, the way like advertising just evolved, right? Is I'm not like a big fan of like, what is it? Great man of history theory or anything like that. But it's like, no, you can literally point to this one individual person, Edward L. Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud, and like, it's nothing but like a path of destruction and evil. Yeah,
I gotta look more into this. I'm convinced.
Like the term public relations, Pat?
Yeah.
He literally got told, all right, you can't use propaganda because it sounds too German, right? So he came up with the term public relations.
Yeah, which is literally just propaganda. Yeah, yes. And propaganda is this like bastardized word that like anytime anyone says like, oh, that's propaganda, but like literally anything that has a message seeks to like convince or impress something upon you is literally propaganda. Every single commercial that you've ever seen in your entire life, every sign you walk by, every billboard is a piece of propaganda. It's like a very general term,
yes,
very nefarious attachment to it.
But that's the thing, is that like propaganda is a tool, right? For both ways. This is propaganda. We're propaganda,
of course,
right?
We have a message, and we want people to hear it, and we want to impress something upon people. I mean, absolutely. We are propagating something here.
Yeah, I think like the best way I've ever heard it phrased is by Ian Goodrum. like he's a journalist in China or whatever, but like he was born in America, but he phrased it in such a way that like everything is propaganda, right? But everything, all propaganda has a bias, and it's up to you as like the reader to try and like discern, right, what is the bias of that propaganda? Who does it benefit? Does it benefit the working class, or does it benefit like not the working class?
Yeah. And then it does come in. It says, in light of this, one easy solution to overconsumption would be to ban advertising, at least in public spaces where people don't have a choice about what they see. This may sound impossible, but Sao Paulo, a city of 20 million people, has already done it. I have like an article here about Sao Paulo and the what they passed, but it may sound draconian or weird to like ban advertising, but one of my favorite things about my time in Cuba was that you can walk down the street in the city and there isn't like a cigarette or a Coca-Cola ad like every 5 seconds that you walk. It is quite nice to not be bombarded by advertising every step of the way.
So I want to visit the DPRK.
Now here's something crazy, and I didn't even realize this. Until I got to it, and it just hit me. Do you know what the last section of this book is called?
What?
Do you have it?
I got it open. I'm looking at it right now.
It's called
Regenerating Hope.
What are the 2 books that I've brought up more times in this stream than any other?
Well, you've got what is it? What is it? Shattered Hope or whatever?
Yes.
And then the other one, oh fuck! It's the one with the drone on the front of it. What the fuck is it called?
Killing Hope.
Killing Hope.
So throughout these 6 or 7 streams that we've done, routinely, at least once or multiple times per stream, I bring up Killing Hope and Shattered Hope to corroborate or illustrate certain points that are made in this book. And what is the last section called?
Regenerating Hope, like the way a salamander regenerates a limb.
How do you like that? How perfect is that?
Look at that. You didn't even do it on purpose.
I didn't. It was completely non-intentional, but nonetheless magical.
Yeah, we don't pre-watch these books, folks. A lot of times we are literally like
now the last chapter I thought was kind of weird, like as opposed to like being like a kind of conclusion. It's more so just being like, hey, guess what? There's like regenerative soil practices that are really good.
Well, no, I mean, like it's an important positive note to land on because
it doesn't feel like a wrap up though. It doesn't feel like it should be the last.
There is no wrap up. It's like,
it talks about soil and then it's like over.
Yeah, here's a 9-minute video that I'm going to put in chat.
But you know what we can wrap it up with?
What?
The quote that is in that chapter by a spiritual advisor of this stream.
Yeah.
Do you know who that is?
That is, to the real ones, to the realest of real, Frantz Fanon. Even though I am not an Anglophone, or Francophone, so I'm probably mispronouncing the fuck out of his name every time.
You want to read it?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
All right. I was like, should I do a French accent? No.
Don't.
Come then, comrade.
Or just read it regular.
I'm just going to read it regular.
Yeah.
Come. Come then, comrades. The European game has finally ended. We must find something different. We today can do everything, so long as we do not imitate Europe. So long as we are not obsessed by the desire to catch up with Europe. Europe now lives at such a mad, reckless pace that she has shaken off all guidance and all reason, and she is running headlong into the abyss. We would do well to avoid it with all possible speed. The third world today faces Europe like a colossal mass whose aim should be to try to resolve the problems to which Europe has not been able to find the answers. But let us be clear. What matters is to stop talking about output and intensification and the rhythm of work. No, we do not want to catch up with anyone. What we want to do is go forward all the time, night and day, in the company of man, in the company of all men. So, comrades, let us not pay tribute to Europe by creating states, institutions, and societies which draw their inspiration from her. Humanity is waiting for something other from us than such an imitation.
That's it. That's a wrap on The Divide, the first book installment in the Subversive History interactive podcast stream.
Europe is not real. Europe is the Asian Peninsula, so-called Europe. Okay, that's what Europe actually is. So
Tune in on Wednesday.
What?
Go ahead.
I was gonna say, like, there's some other stuff like at the end where he talks about, like, how Bolivia, put.
I don't have.
Seriously?
Yeah.
All right. Well, whatever. Indigenous activists have brought the concept of Sumac Kase to prominence.
No, that is the Quechua term.
Yeah, living in harmony and balance. Recognize we are interconnected, that we are part of a whole well-being that is inextricable from that of our ecosystems. Recognize the inalienable rights of ecosystems to survive and flourish. And there's India talking about the ecological Swaraj. Like, there's, but yeah, we finished the book, everybody.
So tune in on Wednesday for the first introductory installment of our reading of The Counter-Revolution of 1776 by Gerald Horne, which is, I'm obviously giving you a very quick summarization of the book that I have not read yet. But I think it's like about the slave resistance and how slave resistance caused the American Revolution as like a response to like slave independence.
It's going to be great, everybody. And I'm hoping, I have not reached out to him. What's that?
I'm just going to show the Google Books thing.
Yeah.
Okay, so the Counter-Revolution of 1776, slave resistance and the origins of the United States. The successful 1776 revolt against British rule in North America has been hailed almost universally as a great step forward for humanity, but the Africans then residing in the colonies overwhelmingly sided with London. In this trailblazing book, Gerald Horne compliments his earlier celebrated Negro comrades of the Crown by showing that in the prelude to 1776, the abolition of slavery seemed all but inevitable in London, delighting Africans as much as it outraged slaveholders and sparking the colonial revolt. In the prelude to 1766, more and more Africans were joining the British military, and anti-slavery sentiments were deepening through Britain and in the Caribbean. Rebellious Africans were chasing Europeans to the mainland, unlike their counterparts in London. The Europe colonists overwhelmingly associated enslaved Africans with subversion and hostility to the status quo. You get it. I could go on reading the whole thing, but this is the general overview of the book. I think this is going to be awesome because the first book we did was Inventing Reality by Michael Perenni, which is kind of like a not necessarily a history book. And then this was kind of like a anthropological economics book that was based on a lot of history, but this will be like an actual like history project that we're going to go on and go through this book and discuss it and validate it and see the sources and everything like that.
I think of American Revolution as a schism of the British Empire, so this looks up my alley. Oh yeah, no, it.
Yeah, this is a very well received. Don't look at this rating here. Like within like leftist circles, this is a very highly touted book.
Gerald Horne honestly needs like way more praise than he gets.
On Amazon, it's 5-star. It's like pretty much it's 4.7.
So yeah, who should we raid?
Oh, I don't know. You know the people. I'm gonna bow out though, so I can go and eat and get these assignments completed.
Cool.
I love you guys. Love you, Johnny.
Love you, Pat.
Johnny, hit me up in a little bit so we can talk about like I don't know whatever we need to talk about. But all right. Everybody, appreciate you. Great stream. Great having everybody here. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Well, salam, buddy.
Well, salam.
All right, chat. This is your time to shine. Who do you want to get? Who do you want to raid? Any takers? There's only like 8 of you in here. Because if not, I guess we'll do bread theory. I don't know. I think they're like tangentially related to like Poor Pearl's Almanac. I don't know. All right. Well, nobody's responding with anything, so I'm just gonna send you guys to bread theory. Check it out if you want. But Saturday night. Oh, Sunday nights. I read that wrong. How do I do this again? It's like /red theory. All right. Lost Salam. Stay strong. Have a good night, everybody.